This meeting will come to order. Today we have a hearing titled Secrecy in the Response to Bear's Fatal Chemical Plant Explosion. Before we begin with opening statements, I ask unanimous consent that the contents of our document binder be entered into the record, provided that the committee staff may redact any information that is business proprietary, relates to privacy concerns, or is law enforcement sensitive. Without objection, the documents will be entered into the record. I ask unanimous consent that the supplemental memo prepared by the majority staff be entered into the record. Without objection, the documents will be entered into the record. Now the chairman, ranking member, and chairman emeritus will be recognized for 5 minutes for an opening statement. Other members of the subcommittee will be recognized for 3 minutes for their opening statement. I will begin. On August 28, 2008, a tank exploded at the Bear CropScience chemical plant in Institute, West Virginia. The explosion sent a fireball hundreds of feet into the air and was felt 10 miles away. I have here photographs of the accident and its aftermath. The explosion captured from a distance. The destruction at the plant, I'll flip that over to one, and then a pair of safety goggles encased in chemical residue. Before I go any further, I'd like to express on behalf of the entire subcommittee our condolences to the families of the 2 employees, Barry Withrow and Bill Oxley, who were killed as a result of the explosion. We acknowledge the tremendous personal sacrifices and pain these people and their families have been put through as a result of this tragic incident. We also thank the emergency first responders who protected the public that night, especially the 6 volunteer firefighters who suffered from nausea, intestinal and respiratory disturbances as a result of the exposure that night. We are tremendously grateful for their service and the service of all our public safety personnel. Today the committee is examining not only what actually happened, but what could have happened. About 80 feet from the blast site was a day tank that can store nearly 40,000 pounds of methyl isocyanate, or MIC. MIC is the chemical that killed thousands of people and sickened tens of thousands in 1984 after a release of the toxic chemical at the Bhopal, India. The explosion at the Bear plant in West Virginia caused a 2.5-ton steel vessel containing methanol to rupture and be violently propelled in a northeasterly direction, leaving a path of destruction. Had the projectile headed south and struck the MIC tank, the subcommittee today might be examining a catastrophe rivaling the Bhopal disaster. As it happened, the explosion caused shrapnel to damage the protective blast blanket around the MIC day tank. Immediately after the explosion, local emergency responders tried to obtain crucial information from Bear representatives, information that was essential to determine how best to protect the public and their own personnel from possible chemical contamination. For example, the emergency responders were trying to determine whether to order the community shelter in place, which is to stay in their homes with doors and windows closed. A shelter in place order must be announced soon after a chemical release in order to be effective. The fire department in Nitro, West Virginia reported, "We have a cloud of some type that is dark. It's moving towards Nitro. Can you please try to get some information so you can tell us what it is?" Bear rebuffed the emergency responders' efforts to obtain information about the explosion. When the 911 dispatcher asked the company to confirm whether the explosion took place in the Larvin unit, which contains toxic chemicals, Bear responded, "No, that's all. I'm only allowed to tell you that we have an emergency in the plant." At least 6 state and local emergency responders were denied entry to the plant to investigate the explosion. As Kent Carper, the president of Kanawha County Commission, wrote to Bear a week after the explosion, Metro 911 repeatedly asked for information and was refused. This was a complete abdication of Bear's responsibility to your neighbors and to our first responders, who were sent uninformed to an explosion because no one was allowed to inform us. We will hear testimony today from Mr. Carper, as well as from other officials and representatives of the local community. The United States Chemical Safety and Hazard Board, CSB, an independent federal agency, is conducting an investigation with the goal of reporting to the public on the cause of the accident and recommending changes to prevent future accidents like this one. We will hear today from the chairman of the CSB on the board's preliminary findings. For the first time during a CSB investigation, a company sought to limit CSB's use of documents and information by labeling it Sensitive Security Information, SSI, under the Maritime Transportation Security Act. Although the law is supposed to prevent the public release of information that might compromise national security, Bear has now admitted that it began using this SSI label, in part, to prevent negative publicity and stymie public debate about the safety of its processes. William Buckner, the president and CEO of Bear CropScience, says in his written testimony for today's hearing that Bear invoked SSI out of, quote, a desire to limit negative publicity generally about the company or the Institute facility, to avoid public pressure to reduce the volume of MIC that is produced and stored at an institute by changing to alternative technologies, end of quote. In one document Bear produced to the subcommittee, company counsel instructed that the assertion of sensitive security information should be liberal and should strike any releases to any piece of equipment, piping, or document involving MIC or chlorine, a process that resulted in the marking of thousands of pages of documents. Finally, the committee's investigation has uncovered several troubling facts that further raise concerns about an orchestrated effort by Bear to shroud the explosion in secrecy. Bear removed and destroyed the blast blanket that surrounded the MIC tank, pictured here with visible damage. There's a photo up there in the top part. The whereabouts of this important piece of evidence is unknown. Air monitoring devices designed to determine whether MIC has been released into the air were not operational on the night of the explosion. Video cameras positioned to capture the site of explosion did not record the time period of the explosion because they had been disconnected from the recording unit. Bear's pattern of secrecy raises serious questions, not just about Bear, but also about whether the law adequately protects the public's right to have information about potential dangers in their communities and what their communities face and how those dangers might be minimized. Today we will ask whether the Security Sensitive Information Designation system is susceptible to abuse, given the committee's investigation has revealed that a private chemical company, which has the most to lose, invoked SSI in part out of business motive of limiting public discussion of the fact that it continues to be the only company in America that still stores large quantities of methyl isocyanate, or MIC, on site. We will also explore ways for companies to employ safer technologies to protect their communities so tragedies like this do not happen again. Next, I'd turn to Mr. Walden from Oregon for his opening statement, please, sir.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. And before I start, I want to recognize our colleague, Shelley Moore Capito, who has joined us today. And while I appreciate your allowing her to join us on the dais, even though she's not a member of this committee and therefore is not allowed to participate in the process, we do appreciate her involvement in this issue since it is in her district and I think maybe even in her hometown. And she has been very helpful in providing background information to me and probably others on the committee. I join you, Mr. Chairman, also in expressing our condolences and sympathies for those who lost their lives and our praise for those public safety officials who rose to the challenge on a very difficult night in that part of West Virginia. The subject of this hearing revolves around communications and information provided by Bear CropScience during and after the fatal explosion and fire at its Riverside chemical plant outside of Charleston. Our bipartisan investigation leading up to this hearing is focused on the concerns this single troubling incident has raised among first responders, the surrounding community, and federal safety investigators. For more than 21 years, my wife and I were small business owners out in Oregon. We're in the radio business and therefore have been very closely involved with emergency communications, alerting the communities, trying to get information in a timely manner. And so as I've read some of the background here, obviously there are some enormous lessons to be learned about what didn't work right on that evening. And I'll tell you, if I were in that community, I would share the frustration that's been shared already by many in that community for the lack of knowledge. The hearing today will examine these concerns closely, I'm sure, and will also hopefully shed some light on a broader tension between the public safety information and sensitive security obligations of chemical and other industrial facilities following this accident. Given the Energy and Commerce Committee's primary jurisdiction over public health and safety, it is incumbent upon us to confront this tension so that we can identify whether additional congressional action or guidance is necessary. To the people and first responders along the Kanawha River, the explosion on the night of August 28th didn't really involve federal rules and regulations about safety and security. They were immediately concerned about what was engulfed in that fireball and escaping in a cloud of smoke and mist blowing in the wind downriver from the facility. That's what worried them. The police and firemen along the river from Nitro, St. Albans, Dunbar, South Charleston, Jefferson, Kanawha County knew that many very dangerous chemicals were used at the Bear plant. In fact, some of them were employees of the plant. Others had relatives who worked there. They had been on site. They had friends or family who worked there. They knew about phosgene and chlorine. They knew about methyl isocyanate, or MIC, the toxic chemical notorious for killing and sickening thousands of people in India. What they did not know, and what Bear would not confirm with any specific information for nearly 3 hours, was what chemicals were associated with that fire and whether anything toxic risked being released into the community. They could not even get confirmation where the fire was for nearly an hour and a half. Bear wouldn't let them into the facility. The county sheriff had to get fire information through a deputy's family contact in the plant. Frankly, folks, that's unacceptable. What Bear would say in its main communications to the County Metro 911 and Emergency Operations Center was, quote, "Our response team is responding to our emergency," close quote, and sometimes would add, quote, "alert the public," close quote. This went on all night. Alert the public about what? Now, having been not in a chemical situation, but having been again in the radio business, when things break loose, the public wants more information, and the media can actually be helpful in calming the fears or help people do the right things. We'll learn today that Bear CropScience has a very capable fire brigade. It managed to control the fire largely on its own. But this does not absolve the company of its obligations to the community. As County Commission President Kent Carper, a witness today, noted a few days later, Kanawha County emergency officials were given no information during this critical time to make proper decisions to ensure the safety of its citizens. Fortunately, the fire did not result in a major toxic release, but emergency responders lacking information had to notify some 40,000 residents to take shelter in their homes. Imagine the concern that generated. We'll take testimony on what Bear and first responders have done to resolve communications issues, which reportedly have been addressed. Yet as we move from the communications during the incident to the ensuing federal safety investigation, we find continuing problems. Chief among these is the ability of the Federal Chemical Safety Board, the CSB, to investigate, examine, and report unhindered, full and necessary information about the causes of the explosion. Similar to the federal investigations following airplane crashes, the CSB reports result and makes recommendations that can improve safety throughout the industry. This is a critical function for enhancing public safety. Security-sensitive information about chemical plants does need to be protected against terrorists. But Bear CropScience admits using the federal law and such information to frankly restrict legitimate public discussion by CSB about critical safety processes for certain chemicals at the site and to prevent public debate. At least initially, the U.S. Coast Guard, the arbiter of security designations, and CSB both had to take company assertions at face value, in part due to a lack of familiarity with and clarity in the regulations as they apply to chemical facilities. This is a policy matter beyond the Bear case that may require congressional attention. Allowing inappropriate use of sensitive security information designations to hide inconvenient facts is simply not acceptable and undermines public safety. Moving forward, we have to ensure the rules are clear and that CSB and the U.S. Coast Guard can work out bureaucratic differences so that public safety can be addressed effectively and with our security needs. I welcome the witnesses, and I thank you, Mr. Chairman, for this hearing.
Thank you, Mr. Walden. Chairman of the full committee, Mr. Waxman, for an opening statement, please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Today's hearing is important not only for the residents of West Virginia, but for people across the country who live near chemical plants and may be concerned about their safety. This morning, I'd like to do two things. First, I'd like to provide some historical context for today's hearing, and secondly, I'd like to describe some of the specific findings of the committee's investigation into the Bayer explosion. I've been working on the issues relating to chemical security for several decades. On December 14, 1984, when I was chair of the committee's Health Subcommittee, we held a field hearing in West Virginia to examine the safety record of the very same plant we're discussing today. Back then, the plant was owned by Union Carbide. We called that hearing because earlier that month, the company's sister plant in Bhopal, India, released 25 to 45 tons of an extremely toxic chemical called methyl isocyanate, killing approximately 4,000 people and injuring tens of thousands of others. We wanted to make sure that we never had a similar incident here. As a result of the committee's work on this issue, we passed legislation in 1990 to create the Chemical Safety and Hazard Investigation Board. Congress gave the board broad investigative powers, authorized it to identify measures to reduce the likelihood of the consequences of an accidental release, and charged it with recommending ways to make chemical production, processing, handling, and storage as safe and free from risk of injury as is possible. The board is investigating the recent Bayer explosion, and we're pleased to have Chairman John Bresland with us today to present his preliminary findings. In my opinion, the most significant problem we face today is that we're examining the same chemical plant in West Virginia, although it is now owned by Bayer, and the same toxic chemical, MIC. Although other chemical companies like DuPont have invested in safer technologies to eliminate their MIC stockpiles, Bayer's facility in West Virginia is the only site in the United States that continues to produce and store large amounts of methyl isocyanate. 25 years after the catastrophe in India, I think it's finally time to ask whether it makes sense to allow Bayer to continue producing and storing such massive amounts of this highly toxic chemical. I know the Chemical Safety Board is considering how to address this issue, so I want to make absolutely clear that Congress will look to the board for specific and concrete recommendations on how Bayer can reduce its MIC stockpile and change its procedures to inherently safer technologies. This is not an easy task, but it's essential, and time has occurred for us to get on with this job already. Now let me turn to the findings of our investigation. We have a detailed memo that was compiled by our committee staff, and it sets forth the result of our investigation. The committee reviewed more than 200,000 pages of documents, as well as audio and video recordings obtained from Bayer, the Coast Guard, and the Environmental Protection Agency, and the Chemical Safety Board. Committee staff also inspected Bayer's plant in West Virginia and interviewed more than 20 Bayer employees, first responders, elected officials, and concerned residents. Based on this evidence, our overall conclusion is that Bayer engaged in a campaign of secrecy by withholding critical information from local, county, and state emergency responders, by restricting the use of information provided to federal investigators, by attempting to marginalize news outlets and citizen groups concerned about the dangers posed by Bayer's activities, and by providing inaccurate and misleading information to the public. We have three specific findings. First, on the night of the explosion, Bayer failed to provide emergency responders with critical information about the scope of the explosion, the potential chemical hazards involved, or the actions needed to safeguard the surrounding communities. Second, there are serious questions about the vulnerabilities of Bayer's inventory of MIC and about MIC monitoring systems that were out of service at the time of the explosion. And third, Bayer is now attempting to conceal information about the explosion by invoking and in some cases misusing a statute governing maritime transportation security to designate unprecedented amounts of material as, quote, sensitive security information, end quote. The memo goes into greater detail about the evidence that forms the basis of these findings. And, Mr. Chairman, I ask unanimous consent that the memo and the documents it refers to be made part of the official hearing record.
Without objection, I think we previously.
That has previously been
Yes,
agreed
sir.
to. Thank you. Finally, I would like to extend special thanks to the local, county, and state emergency responders and other officials from West Virginia who worked with our staff on this investigation and traveled here today to answer the committee's questions. Mr. Chairman, I want to thank you very much for holding this hearing and doing this investigation.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Next, Ms. Sutton from Ohio for an opening statement. 3 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Stupak, and thank you for holding today's important hearing on the secrecy and the response to Bayer's fatal chemical plant explosion. And to the families of those who lost their lives as a result of this explosion, I am deeply sorry. There's nothing quite like the fear of the unknown. You know, musicians have written songs, and Hollywood has made countless movies about this fear. And on August 28, 2008, families and rescue workers throughout the community of Institute, West Virginia, lived through this fear. They knew some information. They knew that an explosion shot a fireball more than 100 feet into the sky. They knew that the fire was raging inside Bayer's facility, the only facility in the United States that continues to store MIC. This is the same highly toxic chemical that killed thousands of people in an industrial disaster in India in 1984. According to Dale Petrie, the director of the Office of Emergency Services for Kanawha County in West Virginia, and I quote, "We didn't know what to do. We want to protect the community, and we need more information to do that," end quote. That is not an acceptable place to leave our first responders. He said, "We didn't know what to do." Without the proper information, actions cannot be taken in a timely fashion to inform and protect the public. And without the proper information, those charged with protecting the public are left to plan for the absolute worst case instead of an actual situation which can waste a lot of time and resources. And for the sake of our safety, our firefighters and other first responders face dangers every day throughout my district and throughout communities across the country. And increasingly, they're called to do so under cash-strapped conditions and understaffing. They can't afford to waste resources, and they certainly cannot afford to operate in a crisis without knowledge, all the knowledge that we can give them to safely do their jobs and protect their communities. And our constituents deserve a system that works, a system that keeps them safe. I take my responsibility to ensure the safety of Americans very seriously. Congress, through this committee's hard work, created the Chemical Safety and Hazard Investigation Board in 1990 as an independent agency to investigate chemical accidents and provide public recommendations and findings to help prevent future accidents. After 9/11, additional laws such as the Maritime Transportation Security Act were passed aimed at protecting the public from potential terrorist attacks. But we now find ourselves in a situation where two laws, both aimed at protecting the public, failed to get the job done. And I think that the laws had some help. The accident and the actions taken and not taken in the aftermath of the accident caused grave harm. We owe it to the families of those who lost their lives. We owe it to the first responders who were on the scene. We owe it to the community in West Virginia. And we owe it to communities throughout this country to get to the bottom of what has happened and take the actions that are necessary to make sure, if it ever should happen again, which we hope to prevent, that things will be handled differently and more effectively. And I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Braley for opening statement, please. 3 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member Walden, for holding this hearing. You know, we talk a lot about accountability on this committee, and we talk a lot about transparency. But what I thought about as I was reviewing the materials in preparation for this hearing is a public relations course that I took when I was a college student at Iowa State University. where Bear has a huge presence. And the number one thing that you're taught in a public relations course in response to disaster of this magnitude is the first thing you do is own up to your responsibility. You accept responsibility for it, and you communicate to the public your plan to make sure that it never happens again. If Bear had been graded on their project based upon the response they made to this disaster, they would have gotten an F. That's the bottom line of why we're here today. Our job is to get to the bottom of what went wrong, to get answers to the people in this community who are entitled to answers, and to get a commitment from this corporation about what they're going to do to change their corporate behavior and start to put a better image forward of corporate responsibility. This is not an isolated incident that happens in one community in West Virginia. It's the type of risk that U.S. citizens are exposed to every day. And in light of what's been going on recently on Wall Street and in other parts of the economic sector, it's time for American companies to realize that the best way for them to generate profits for their shareholders is by being frank and forthright when they do something wrong, to accept responsibility for it, and to look into the eyes of the people they've harmed and say, we will make this better. We will make sure this doesn't happen again. And that's what I hope happens as a result of this hearing, and I'll yield back.
Ms. Christensen for an opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Chairman.
Is your mic on?
Security. If we can fix what went wrong during the incident of August 2008, it would not only ensure the safety and reassure people living in the areas adjacent to Bayer CropScience, but it will do so and be reassuring for people all over our country who live near chemical, nuclear, and other plants that house and store hazardous material. As a former emergency services coordinator, then responsible for health during two of the worst hurricanes that hit any part of the United States at that time, I find the lack of information sharing and the failure of coordination of response at the time of the incident shocking and totally unacceptable. I'm very concerned not only about the withholding of vital information the community needed to have, but also about the lack of a clear incident command process that would have linked the plant to those responsible for the safety of the community. And I'm especially concerned since I have an oil refinery and several other smaller chemical plants on a small 82-square-mile island that has less people than live in the area surrounding Bayer CropScience. And all of the plants are on the water and come under Coast Guard and the MTSA. The entire island of St. Croix, 60,000 people, including my daughter and grandchildren, would be in grave danger if there was an accident and the response was not quick and appropriate. I also have a long and excellent relationship with the Coast Guard and admire and applaud their history of service and readiness to protect and save lives under any and every circumstance, and it pains me to see them drawn into this situation, especially on an issue of possibly withholding information the public is entitled to have. And I trust that this will be cleared up during the hearing. I'm sure we'll examine this and other areas of concern, and so I look forward to the testimonies, and I thank everyone for coming here to share information with us this afternoon. I yield back.
Thank you, and that concludes the opening statements by all members of the subcommittee. Almost concludes. Mr. Markey, recognized for an opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, very much. I appreciate your recognizing me. On December 3rd, 1984, an accident at a Union Carbide pesticide plant in Bhopal, India, released 42 tons of toxic methyl isocyanate, or MIC, gas, killing thousands of people and injuring many more. Reports regarding the accident's cause indicated that in addition to questions surrounding the maintenance of the plant, other factors also contributed to the catastrophe. Union Carbide was using toxic MIC, even though a safer substitute that could have reduced the consequences of the accident was available. Union Carbide was storing the toxic MIC in large tanks instead of smaller ones, the use of which could have reduced the consequences of the accident. Last summer, when a chemical tank exploded at a Bayer facility in West Virginia, sending a fireball into the sky and killing 2 employees. That facility was just like the facility in Bhopal, storing large quantities of the same chemical, and just like the facility in Bhopal, the Bayer facility could have chosen to use safer processes that eliminated or greatly reduced the need for the toxic chemicals in the first place. But unlike the Bhopal catastrophe, the people of West Virginia were relatively lucky because, quite by chance, the explosion that caused the 2 tragic deaths did not result in a release of large quantities of MIC gas that could have killed thousands more. That is because when the 8 by 10-foot steel vessel became a violent projectile missile as a result of the explosion, it happened to travel in the opposite direction, away from the MIC tank. And although the accident ultimately caused 2 fatalities and the demolition of the area within the facility, the most catastrophic consequence, the release of almost 7 tons of MIC gas, did not occur. The explosion at the Bayer plant highlights the need for all facilities storing large quantities of dangerous chemicals to assess whether there are safer ways they could do business and to use these technologies when possible. Today's hearing is about an accident, another chilling scenario that would-be terrorists who target these facilities could cause a catastrophic accident. And I'm committed to ensuring that the use of safer technologies and processes be part of the legislation which we ultimately pass. I thank my colleagues for all of their hard work on this legislation, and I thank you, Mr. Chairman, for recognizing me.
Thank you, Mr. Markey. Well, that now concludes the statements by members of the subcommittee. I want to recognize our colleague, as the ranking member said, Ms. Capito, Shelley Moore Capito, who represents and lives near Institute, West Virginia. Ms. Capito, you're welcome to sit through this hearing and observe, and I understand you have an opening statement or written statement for the record. Okay, I'm going to ask unanimous consent that Ms. Capito's statement be entered into record without objection, so be. Also, Senator Rockefeller from West Virginia has also submitted an opening statement that will also be made part of record. Do I hear any objection? Hearing no objection, it will also be made part of the record. I now call our first panel of witnesses. On our first panel, we have Mr. John Bresland, who is chairman of the U.S. Chemical Safety and Hazard Investigation Board, CSB. Mr. Joseph Crawford, who is the chief of police for the city of St. Albans, West Virginia. Mr. Michael Dorsey, who is the chief of Homeland Security and Emergency Response for the West Virginia Department of Environmental Protection. Mr. Kent Carper, who is the president of Kanawha County Commission in Kanawha County, West Virginia. And Ms. Pamela Nixon, who is an environmental advocate with the West Virginia Department of Environmental Protection. Welcome to all of our witnesses. It's the policy of this subcommittee to take all testimony under oath. Please be advised that you have the right under the rules of the House to be advised by counsel during your testimony. Do you wish to be represented by counsel? Any of you?
No.
Shaking their head no? Okay. So then I'm going to ask you to please rise and raise your right hand to take the oath. Do you swear or affirm the testimony you're about to give to be the truth, the whole truth, nothing but truth, and matter pending before this committee?
I do.
Let the record reflect that witnesses have replied in the affirmative. You are now under oath, and that includes your opening statement. We will now hear opening statement from each of you. If you have a longer statement, we'll submit it for the record, but please try to keep your comments to 5 minutes. We'll start with you, Mr. Bresland, if you don't mind. For an opening statement, you might have to press that button on that mic there.
I have pressed it.
There you go. I can hear you. Great.
Yep. Thank you, Chairman Stupak, Ranking Member Walden, and also Chairman Waxman for attending today. I'd also like to thank Congresswoman Capito for attending. I am one of her constituents living in West Virginia, but not in the area where the accident took place. Also, I thank all the other distinguished members of the panel of the committee who are here today. I'm speaking today on my own behalf as CSB Chairman and not necessarily for the other board members. The Chemical Safety Board is an independent federal agency that investigates major chemical accidents at fixed facilities. Our public reports, recommendations, and safety videos are used worldwide to help save lives, protect the environment, and promote safer industrial operations. Mr. Chairman, the explosion at Bayer CropScience was a very serious and tragic event, and it had the potential for additional grave consequences. The explosion occurred during the restarting of the plant's methamil production unit, when highly toxic and reactive methamil waste was overloaded into a residue treater vessel. A violent runaway reaction ruptured the 5,000-pound vessel and sent it careening through the production unit, breaking pipes and equipment, leaving a 50-long-foot swath, if I'm pronouncing that word correctly, of destruction. The explosion and resulting chemical release and fire fatally injured 2 employees. 6 volunteer firefighters and 2 others showed likely symptoms of chemical exposure. The blast waste damaged businesses thousands of feet away. Mr. Chairman, our investigation has revealed that significant lapses in process safety management set the stage for this accident. Plant operators had received inadequate training on a new computer control system, which was being used for the first time. Written operating procedures were outdated and could not be followed during startups due to long-standing equipment problems. The heater for the residue treater was known to be undersized. This regularly forced operators to defeat 3 critically important safety interlocks during startups, increasing the chance of dangerously overloading the treater with methamil. This long-standing practice was known to Bayer management prior to the explosion. I'm also troubled by Bayer's delays in providing county 911 officials and the National Response Centre with accurate information about the nature of the ongoing emergency and the hazardous chemicals involved. In addition, there is the question that many of the public are concerned about: what else could have happened? The Bayer plant manufactures and stores very large quantities of some of the deadliest substances used in industry, including phosgene gas and methyl isocyanate, or MIC. Following Bhopal, other companies moved to inherently safer technologies that largely eliminate MIC storage. Bayer is the last company that still stores large quantities of MIC. Approximately 80 feet to the southwest of the methamil residue treater, there is a 30,000-pound vessel capacity MIC storage tank which contained almost 7 tons of MIC on the night of the accident. During the explosion, metal projectiles weighing up to 100 pounds flew in all directions. Some landed near the MIC tank. If the MIC tank had been damaged by a powerful projectile, or the residue treater itself, which had a great deal of energy, there might have been a catastrophic impact on workers, responders, and the public. Finally, I'm concerned about Bayer's recent secrecy claims, which surfaced in February right after we told the company we were planning a public hearing on our preliminary findings. Bayer now contends that around 2,000 pages of previously submitted investigative documents should be treated as sensitive security information, or SSI, under the Maritime Transportation Security Act. Simply understanding which of these SSI markings are proper or not is a daunting task for all of the agencies involved, including the Chemical Safety Board and the Coast Guard. In close consultation with the Coast Guard and with DHS, we decided to proceed with the CS public meeting, which will now occur this Thursday in Institute, West Virginia. I still have significant concerns about how these information protection rules may negatively impact this and future CSB investigations. And I'm asking Congress to consider the following. Companies should not be able to claim OSHA and EPA safety compliance documents or routine business records as secret. The information protection rules for chemical plants should be harmonized across the different branches of DHS. And finally, the CSB and other public safety agencies should not be subject to potential sanctions when conducting their congressionally mandated job of reporting to the public on the causes of accidents. We should not be threatened with losing our job or being fined as a result of doing our job properly here in Washington. I call for a reaffirmation of the public's right to know so that we at the CSB can continue to fulfill our mission to save the lives of workers and the public from chemical accidents. I thank you for this opportunity to testify today.
Thank you, Mr. Bresland. Mr. Dorsey, your statement, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Chairman Stupak, Ranking Member Walton, Congresswoman Capito, and ladies and gentlemen, thank you for the opportunity to be here today. My name is Mike Dorsey. The explosion at the Institute West Virginia Bear facility, which shook the entire area and eventually claimed the lives of two workers, was a tragic accident, the effects of which were compounded by a lack of communication about the conditions inside the plant by the on-site command team and a nearly complete failure of the incident command system as a result of that failure. Perhaps of greater consequence, Bear's attempt to stifle the report of the Chemical Safety Board by citing the Marine Transportation Security Act's provisions regarding port security plans, which in and of itself is a greater communication failure. The Maritime Transportation Security Act of 2002, or MTSA, is legislation which seeks to improve security at America's ports through a number of measures. But the requirement pertinent to this investigation is that which mandates the preparation of maritime transportation security plans. This requirement has become an issue in this instance because the law states, and I'm quoting, "Information developed under this chapter is not required to be disclosed to the public," unquote. It is under this language that Bear has sought to block the findings of the Chemical Safety Board. Bear is able to make this assertion because of the broad definition of facility in the Act, which includes, and I'm quoting again, "any facility of any kind," unquote, on waters subject to the jurisdiction of that law. The relevant definition does not present a problem when normal port facilities which deal only with the loading and unloading of various cargoes are considered. When facilities such as chemical plants or other manufacturing facilities, whose major emphasis is the manufacturing of goods rather than the shipping of goods, are included wholesale under this definition, vast areas over which the Coast Guard has no expertise or experience are suddenly covered by a protective veil, which other concerned agencies, as well as the public, are prohibited from lifting. Manufacturing processes, chemical storage and transfer methods, and many other physical and administration functions, which have nothing at all to do with the shipping or the port portion of a facility, are now potentially under the purview of an agency which, through no fault of its own, is now expected to make decisions far outside of its mission. The Bear CropScience facility uses many dangerous chemicals such as chlorine, phosgene, methyl isocyanate, and others in its processes. In fact, most large manufacturing facilities use some dangerous materials or equipment. Nearly all major industries in West Virginia are on navigable waterways that are under the jurisdiction of the MTSA. Conceivably, all such chemicals and processes could be concealed using the MTSA. I do believe that the Coast Guard made a wise decision in the case at hand, allowing all information except the times when the MIC tank is to be filled to be disclosed. But I will argue that in spite of their skills, they are not the proper agency to be making decisions regarding chemical processes or other activities far removed from the port setting. As a member of the State Emergency Response Commission with the responsibility for implementing the Emergency Planning and Community Right to Know Act, or EPCRA, I believe that allowing the MTSA to be read as Bear proposes would cripple provisions of this act. EPCRA mandates that local emergency planning committees write plans to address all potential emergency situations in chemical plants, and that critical information be provided by the facility to the Emergency Response Committee. This information would not be available if Bear's reading of the Maritime Transportation Security Act is validated, nor may information required by other acts, such as the Resource Conservation Act, Clean Water Act, and others, be available. A final but critical note on the MTSA is the language that Bear has used to attempt to prevent the CSB's findings from being revealed to the public is not prohibited at all, but is permissive. The Act states that facility plans, and I'm quoting again, are not required to be disclosed, unquote. It does not prohibit such disclosure. In other words, Even if the definition of the facility is broadly interpreted and the entire plan is covered, Bear could still release the information developed under MTSA if it wanted to, in this instance. The choice of whether or not to be a good corporate citizen, in this case, is Bear's. Ladies and gentlemen, I have other testimony and written testimony in your packets. I will now cease my comments.
Thank you, Mr. Dorsey. Mr. Carper, your opening statement, please, sir.
Thank you. Chairman.
You might want to pull that mic towards you a little bit there, one of those two. There you go.
It's the first time someone's ever had to push a microphone in my face. Chairman Stupak and Ranking Member Walden and members of the O&I Subcommittee, and particularly my Congresswoman Capito, I want to thank you for your interest, and I also want to thank you for what I know is your absolutely sincere concern about our two lost family members in the state of West Virginia. I want to thank you. And I do have some written comments. I want to skip through part of it, but when I've heard about your interest in passing communications and knowing we run a 911 center for about 600,000 calls a year, small in the Upper Peninsula, but pretty big for us. But I'm familiar, Chairman, with your record on interoperable communications and how you fought for that, like our Congresswoman Capito. And I've heard the comments about the lack of the command system. You can't dispatch someone if nobody will tell you where to send them to, what's going on, and the nature of the emergency. And with all due respect, it's not a question of whether that happened or not. We've supplied you. Your staff has done an excellent job, by the way. I want to commend them as well. We've supplied them with our tapes. One thing about a 911 center, when we do something right, we know it, and when we do something wrong, we know it. And it's all documented. And I'm not saying the dispatch was perfect, but it was pretty darn good considering what we had, number one. And our first responders were heroic. And it was practically a miracle that one of the other vessels didn't rupture. And that was our problem as we continuously sought to find out what was going on so we could tell police officers, firefighters, paramedics, and the community what they needed to know. And they needed to know. And they didn't know. I'm the former police chief of the city of Charleston. I have not the law enforcement background like the chairman has, but a little bit. And this gentleman next to me has an extensive law enforcement background. And our elected sheriff and chief deputy was on the scene. And they did all they could do, but they knew so little. And as you look through this, we had an event that occurred in December the previous year. And we were assured then that this wouldn't happen again. With me today is our executive director of our 911 center, our former fire chief of the city of Charleston. These folks have extensive experience in managing an emergency, but they were simply there waiting to make decisions, waiting to work. The word waiting is what happened. And as my testimony, Mr. Chairman, you have it, we have the timeline. This went on not for minutes, it went on for hours. And eventually the 911 people, in conjunction with other decision makers, made a decision in the blind, in the dark, to go ahead and issue a shelter-in-place decision. I helped participate in that to some extent. I'm proud of them for doing that. That was exactly what they needed to do. And as you know, the state of West Virginia, our governor, Governor Manchin, has initiated legislation now, which is in my written testimony, where we've changed the rules. The legislature simply won't allow this to happen. Our 911 center also changed the rules. I think at the end of the day, there are two things that concern me. And frankly, I agree 100% with CSB's recommendation. I hope Congress will take a look at that. But you actually have two issues before you. As O&I, whether or not you're going to issue a different stringent requirements on how they're going to handle that. But the more troubling aspect is this veil of secrecy, as y'all described it. And it is a veil of secrecy. And with all due respect to Bear, and by the way, I'll go on record saying they've changed things since then. They are doing certain things. I'm sure they'll testify to that. I've looked at it, and I believe that they have good faith in those efforts. However, we're going to have a public meeting in Institute, West Virginia, this Thursday at 6:30, I believe. What kind of a meeting is that going to be when certain information is still being withheld from the public? And even if they have complied in part after they drug the Coast Guard into this, I mean, Mr. Chairman, this is West Virginia. This isn't Upper Peninsula. We don't have 1,600 miles of coastline. It's a small state, and the idea that the Coast Guard is going to stop the people in Institute, which, by the way, is a heavy minority community, We have over 500 college students at West Virginia State University right in the footprint of this chemical plant. Right now, even if everything seems to go good at this hearing, the people there will believe that critical information is being withheld from them simply because of this insertion of Homeland Security. It's above my pay grade. I don't claim to be an expert on Homeland Security, the Patriot Act, or anything else, but I cannot imagine this Congress had that intent when they passed a law not to let the people know who are sitting as a next-door neighbor to one of the most dangerous chemicals, and I can't pronounce it either. I just call it MIC, but I know enough about it to know it is a very dangerous chemical. And the more you store, the more dangerous it is. And if you're going to store a lot of it, you ought to tell your neighbors what you're doing. And with that, I do again, Chairman, want to thank you for your sincere reflection on our loss and your interest in a very, very serious matter. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Carper. Mr. Crawford, your testimony, please, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First of all, I'd like to thank you very much and brag on your staff. I thought my dealings with them was probably the best I've experienced in my life, my career in law enforcement. Hats off to your staff, did an excellent job. First, I want to take this opportunity to thank you, Mr. Chairman, and distinguished members of this committee for allowing me to speak today. My motivation to provide this committee with the perspective of a responder responsible for the safety of the citizens of our community, as well as the safety of my officers. It's my hope and intention that this hearing today will help you understand what happened on the night of August the 28th, 2008. I want to give you, members of this committee, the most accurate information from a responder's perspective that will help this committee draft legislation and implement changes to make the necessary changes to ensure the citizens of Kanawha County and the first responder safeties are not compromised. I believe this can be done, this can be accomplished by all of us working together. The city of St. Albans is southwest and within line of sight of Bayer CropScience plant. The city of St. Albans is near the western border of Kanawha County. The Kanawha River separates the plant and the town. The population of the city of St. Albans is approximately 11,000 to 12,000 people. U.S. Route 60 is the main highway through town and has a high volume of traffic. I had 3 officers on scene of an unrelated call in the east end of the city when they heard and observed the fire and explosion. My supervisor radioed to Metro 911, Kanawha County Dispatch, Consolidated Dispatch Center, and advised them of the explosion at 10:33 p.m. The officers had direct line of sight to the plant, being almost directly across from the river from the explosion. I was at my residence, which was approximately 2 miles direct line of sight from the plant. The percussion shook my house and rattled the pictures from the walls. I contacted my on-duty shift commander by phone, and he confirmed that he and 2 other officers had witnessed the explosion and fire at the plant. Within minutes, I was receiving phone calls from the local news media. I and Chief Steve Parsons, the St. Albans Fire Department chief, responded to the east end of the city and met with my shift commander within 10 minutes of the explosion. It was obvious that there was a large fire in the direction of the plant. We started assessing the situation and wind conditions. We noticed a large plume moving west towards the cities of St. Albans and Nitro, a city just across the river from us. Chief Parsons and I were in constant contact with Metro 911, trying to learn the gravity of the situation, but were informed that Metro 911 was unable to get any information from the plant. Chief Parsons and I had discussions about ordering a shelter in place for the St. Albans based on our assessment and direction of the plume. We were waiting on more up-to-date information from the incident commander, which came an hour later. The incident commander advised that he did not think that a shelter in place should be ordered for the surrounding areas from his position. Hindsight, if the same situation happened again, we'd have ordered a shelter in place immediately. I was also in contact with my colleagues from other law enforcement agencies. Because no one knew the substance that was being released from the plant, area law enforcement officials were making decisions to close highways in the area of the plant to protect public. I ordered to call out off-duty officers to assist. The traffic diversion plan from our emergency response plan was used. Chief Parsons and I activated our forward operations center there in the city at approximately 11:15 p.m., which is about 45 minutes after the initial call. We still weren't able to obtain information from the Bayer CropScience plants as to the chemicals that were involved. 45 minutes into the event, we still did not have any information from the plant. However, we received information that the incident commander on scene was advising that a shelter-in-place order was not needed. The only information about what was involved came from outside sources that it may be the Larvin unit. At this time, there were low-lying, hazy clouds over the city. At 11:18 p.m., we heard a secondary explosion. At 11:21, we received unofficial information that an explosion had occurred in the Larvin pesticide unit. I had a growing concern about our officers being out in that environment directing traffic for an extended period of time. My colleagues also had the same concern for their officers as well. At 11:42 p.m., Kanawha County Emergency Management Director Dale Petrie issued a shelter-in-place order due to the lack of information coming from the plant. It's common knowledge that MIC is stored and used at the plant on a daily basis. It's very frustrating not having any information about what was being released and trying to make decisions to protect our officers and citizens. I was advised at 11:20 p.m. representatives from the county staged at the main gate of the plant waiting to gain access. I also was advised later that representatives from the Kanawha County Sheriff's Department, County OES, and West Virginia State Fire Marshal's Office had made numerous attempts to gain access to the bear crop plants. This was being done to help coordinate efforts outside the plant. Finally, after 30 to 40 minutes, Bear Crop allowed those representatives inside the plant and escorted them to the EOC. They were placed and sequestered in a separate room connected to the plant EOC, but still had problems getting information to relay back to the county EOC at 0:35 hours, 12:35 a.m. Chief 24, the incident commander, radioed to Metro 911 advising that he still does not know what chemicals are involved. At approximately 1:15 a.m., there were discussions about evacuation. We were advised that the fire was still burning and it could be out of control. It could not be contained. At 2:09 a.m., we were advised that the shelter-in-place had been lifted and the roadways were reopened. At 2:30 a.m., the St. Albans Police and Fire Department units were released and the Forward Operations Center was closed. In closing, Mr. Chairman, I'd like to make a comment to some key problems that we faced that night and some steps that have been taken to correct them. First, the most important issue was the lack of communication and cooperation from the Bear CropScience plant. The record will reflect on numerous occasions that the security guard at the gate was directed not to give out any information to the 911 center. Then once inside the plant, the officials were not given much information so that they could be relayed back to the county EOC. State legislation has been passed to address the notification process where the chemical facility must notify the 911 center within 15 minutes. Bear has purchased radios to be placed with their security supervisor in the emergency vehicle and operations center. Bear will have the capability to use the county OS channel and communicate information directly to the 911 center. The second issue is that there was a breakdown in communication between the incident commander and the EOC. Information was relayed to the incident commander about the impact that the plume had on the surrounding areas such as St. Albans, Nitro Institute, and Jefferson, and it was ignored. This was an issue about sheltering in place for us. The incident commander was not able to see the impact outside the plant. As a city official and responsible for the safety and welfare of our citizens and my responding officers, it made it very difficult to make operational decisions. Records will support that the incident commander, Chief 24, was made aware of the conditions in the surrounding areas. This issue will be resolved in the future by ordering a shelter in place if we not received information from the Bear CropScience plant within 15 minutes. Third issue discussed in the critique and after action reviews were conversations about placing monitors outside of the plant and surrounding areas. Bear has monitors along their fence line property on the riverside of the plant. The discussions also included the capability of the monitors being able to send information back to the county EOC, mobile command center, and other locations. This would allow the command personnel to make better operational decisions to the units out in the field. Bear officials indicated that that would be a good idea and indicated that that may be a asset with some funding at a future time. And the last issue is the security of the plant. From a law enforcement perspective, I believe that Bear needs to make their facility more secure. The reason for this concern is that it could be a potential target for terrorism. When you have an event such as this, the first thing that crossed my mind is an accident or an attack. Due to the nature of the hazard stored and manufactured at the site, one cannot overlook that as a possibility. Just my observations from outside of the plant, there are no barricades at the main entrance of the plant. What would prevent a vehicle from running the main gate there at the guard shack? Another concern is access from the river, the plant side. There's a fence You know, you gain access either by bolt cutters or a saw and go virtually undetected. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Crawford. Ms. Nixon, your opening statement, please. Might want to pull that up there a little bit. Pull it a little closer. Thanks.
I'm Pam Nixon. I'm the environmental advocate with the West Virginia Department of Environmental Protection. My role with the community is to be their ombudsman. I'm not a lawyer, and I do not work in that capacity. On the night of August 28, 2008, while visiting friends in the east end of Charleston, over 10 miles away from the Institute facility, around 10:30, we felt and heard a loud rumble. A statement was made, at least it didn't break the windows. When I arrived home around 11 p.m., it was being reported there had been a major explosion and fire at the Institute plant, but there was no additional information on actions for the public to take for their safety. It had been 30 minutes. No shelter in place had been called. I had lived in West Dunbar, less than 1 mile from the plant, between the years of 1979 and 1990. The Institute area includes 3 small communities and a university. The communities of Institute, Pinewood Park, and West Dunbar. And there's the campus of West Virginia State University, a historically black university, with an enrollment of 5,000 students. CropScience is located to the west end of Institute, near the university, and sits on the north bank of the Kanawha River. Directly across, on the south side of the river, is the unincorporated town of Jefferson, and to the west of Jefferson are the towns of St. Albans and Nitro. Due to their close proximity to the plant, all of the communities are no strangers to chemical emergencies. Depending on the velocity and direction of the wind, it would take less than 15 minutes for a plume from the plant to blow across them. Longtime residents know to stay off the phone and listen to the news for safety instructions during chemical emergencies. But as the minutes began to tick away, my phone began to ring. You see, before then, I was a grassroots activist in the Institute area. I could hear the anxiety in their voices, and also the frustration and anger that this was happening again. Some of the callers said that they were going to Charleston to stay at a hotel until it was safe to return. Others just wanted additional information, since there was no valid information about public safety being reported on the news. I knew what they were feeling. It's like a wave that engulfs you when you hear an explosion, when you feel your home shake, when you see the smoke and the glow of the fire go up into the sky, not knowing what will happen next and fearing for the safety of your family. When you live that close to a chemical plant, you learn that every minute counts. As I said earlier, the plant sits along the river floor. There are 2 roadways also that follow the valley floor. McCorkle Avenue, which is Route 60 on the south side, and Route 25 on the north side of the river. Also on the north side of the river and on the hill above the plant is I-64, a major interstate highway. In the Kanawha Valley, due to the terrain, you have to plan your path of egress in case of an emergency, whether it's from a chemical emergency or an accident blocking your way. For decades, the people of Institute were asking valid health and safety questions even before the 1984 Bhopal tragedy. The very same questions that were asked back then were questions asked by different individuals during the public forums that were held after last year's fire and explosion. Those questions were, is it safe for our families to live here? What were the chemicals involved in the plume? What are the potential health risks? When will the plant stop producing and storing dangerous chemicals in our neighborhoods? And is it safe to eat the vegetables from our gardens? Because this was August, we're in West Virginia, and people have their local gardens in their backyards. Back in 1984, there were no community right-to-know laws. The community and the faculty members from the university, at that time it was a college, organized to form the group People Concerned About MIC. With everyone working together, the group was empowered. They hosted meetings for company officials to explain chemical releases when they occurred. They participated in the national discussions to develop the community right-to-know laws. They worked with universities, medical doctors, and PhDs to conduct health surveys, and they worked with technical advisors on toxic use reduction to present to the plant in 1984 a design for the company to use to reduce the risk to the community. After the right-to-know laws, they utilized this information to for crucial information on the chemicals. Information was finally getting out, but over the past few years, community members have murmured that they were beginning to lose ground in the quality of information that they were receiving when there was an incident. They had been proactive. When chemical releases occur, residents say information is not in a timely manner. At times, it takes weeks, even months, before the company will list the chemical names and provide the health risks to the community. In the past 2 years, there were 2 notable chemical releases, one on December 28th of 2007, and the other last year on August the 28th, 2008. During both events, even the emergency responders complained that they were not given enough information from Bayer CropScience to make informed decisions. After the December 2007 incident, Bayer CropScience vowed at that time to provide emergency services with detailed information during a release. It wasn't until 2 months later, on February 27, 2008, that Bayer officials described the December incident to the Sub-Area Community Improvement Council. They were told the chemical was thiodicarb, which was also known as larvin, a hazardous material used in insecticides. After much criticism about the August 28th incident, Bayer apologized and again vowed to provide detailed information on releases. However, on October 26, 2008, the news media informed Kanawha Emergency Services personnel of an MIC event that had occurred at Bayer around the end of September of 2008. This became such an issue that West Virginia's governor proposed legislation which was passed during this year's 2009 legislative session. This law now requires businesses to report industrial incidences to 911 emergency centers within 15 minutes or be fined up to $100,000. So, as you can see, it is no wonder that residents of Western Kanawha County, particularly Institute residents, have lost confidence in Bayer CropScience providing early notification on chemical releases that happen at their plant. Thank you for allowing me to present this information, and I'm here for the questions.
Thank you, and thank you to all you for your testimony. Mr. Bresland, if I may start with you. Your preliminary report, if I may summarize quickly, you indicated that while they're using this new vessel, this residue treater, that the inadequate training on the computer system, there was a heater undersized. Is that where they bypassed the system? So they sort of bypassed the safety system there on the heater. And that day we had like a temperature rise, and they were getting different readings off the gauges, and that's when they sent the 2 employees down to check the gauges, correct? And then that's when the vessel blew up, if you will.
That's correct.
Okay, and then at the time of the vessel blew up, the video cameras were not working in that area, nor were the air monitors, correct?
That's correct.
Okay. In your preliminary report, is it fair to say that methamil then is the release that had come from this explosion?
Methamil was the cause of the explosion.
Okay.
What happened was a concentrated solution of methamil was fed into the residue treater, and normally it's diluted in the residue treater with a solvent, but in this case it wasn't diluted with a solvent.
Sure.
And eventually it started to overheat, and it became an uncontrollable reaction, and the vessel exploded. What exactly happened after that, we're not sure yet, and we're still doing some work in that, because when the vessel explodes, the methamil has already reacted, and then there was a major fire as well.
Right.
So that would be a continuing part of our investigation to find out just exactly what the outcome was. But if you look at a material safety data sheet for methamil, it does list a series of chemicals that can be formed when it decomposes.
Okay, so methamil obviously was released because the pipes and everything else are exploded that night, right?
Yes.
Okay. Any other chemical, we talked a lot about MIC, any other chemicals you know that may have been released that night?
Well, the chemicals that would have been released would have been the decomposition products from the decomposition of methanol, and I can give you a list of those chemicals.
Okay. And in your preliminary report, you have the exposure symptoms from methamil, correct?
That's correct.
You have on here nervous system disruption, blurred vision, pinpoint pupils, tremors, muscles twitching, nausea, abdominal pain, respiratory arrest, coma, death, liver damage, anemia. Is that correct?
That's correct.
So in this fire, some of the methamil would have been burned in the fire, correct? Some would be remained on the ground, washed away in the fighting the fire into the river. And some might have been carried off into the air, correct?
That's the issue that we need to address, just how much was carried off into the air, because there was a major fire after the explosion.
And we have no idea of knowing how much may have.
We don't at the present time, no.
All right. We showed in our opening statement, well, there's the methanol residue there. You can see the pipes and things like that where it would be released, or because of broken pipe and equipment. Those goggles that I showed in my opening statement, any idea what the chemicals were on that goggle?
That is the first time I'd seen that photograph, so I'm not able to answer that question.
Okay, very good. Let me ask this then, for first responders then, Chief Crawford.
Yes, sir.
There seems to be a major disconnect between the story you tell about Bear's failure to provide information to emergency responders and the story Bears tell that they shared. They say they shared everything. You lead the police department of St. Albans, the city directly across from the river of the plant. Your officers saw the massive fireball from the explosion, notified Metro 911. As you begin coordinating the emergency response for your community, a large, possibly toxic cloud began drifting towards you, your officers, and your citizens. I'd like to show you the transcript of the radio calls between St. Albans Fire Department Metro 911. It's right there in that book there, our document book. You can find it in tab number 2 if you want to follow along. St. Albans Fire. We have a cloud of some type that is dark. It's moving towards Nitro. Can you please try to get some information so you can tell us what it is? Metro. Copy, cloud is moving towards Nitro. I will try and figure out something. The command on scene hadn't said anything about the cloud, but we are still trying to get some information on it. St. Albans Fire. You can see the cloud with the fire right above it for 3 to 4 miles. Metro. Still trying to figure something out on it. St. Albans Fire. If we don't hear something within 5 to 6 minutes, we're going to do a shelter in place in the St. Albans area. Chief Crawford, did you ever receive any information from Bear about what this cloud was? So Metro 911 was forced to go ahead and issue an order to shelter in place without the knowledge of what was in that cloud?
That's correct. We did not receive any information as to what.
Have you ever received any information what they believe composed of that cloud that night of the fire?
No.
In the weeks after the explosion, Bear officials issued a statement on the media that said this: we shared all information available with Metro 911 as that information became available. Do you believe that to be an accurate statement?
My summation is what's in a timely fashion.
Okay,
I believe an hour and a half, an hour is absolutely entirely too long.
Okay. Commissioner Carper.
Yes, Mr. Chairman.
Let me turn to you. You wrote a letter on September 4th to Bear. You find that's tab 6 in the tab that Mr. Crawford has. And you said, Metro repeatedly asked for information and was refused. In fact, no notification from Bear, including the mention of the Larvin unit, until the all clear the next morning. This is a complete abdication of Bear's responsibility. Is that correct?
Yes, sir.
In your testimony today that you provided in advance, Bear's president and CEO says the company sent an official to Metro 911 Center to provide that information. And let me show you what Bear president says. Again, it's in the book there. It says, we're initially surprised when we received criticism from our Metro 911 counterparts and others in our community regarding our communications relating to the incident. CropScience sent a representative from the Institute facility to Metro 911 site who was in direct communication with our EOC. Commissioner Carper, did the official who Bear sent to Metro Center provide you with all the information you needed?
No, sir, because he didn't know anything. And with all due respect, the response from Bear, the record reflects, the only reason why they sent a representative is because I insisted on it due to their previous failure to give us information. I believe it was in December of the previous year. I believe December the 28th, if memory serves me correct. That's why they were there. And I believe it was Mr. Curry. And I had a number of conversations with Mr. Curry. He was a nice person, but he didn't know anything. Just like their security guard, Steve at the gate, didn't know anything. And as your ranking member says, alert the public about what? Now, the record is clear. We've got it on tape. We don't have to guess what they told us and what
Right.
they didn't tell us. They didn't tell us anything.
Well, as Commissioner, have you learned what chemicals your community may have been exposed to that night?
No, sir. I've learned more here today. I had to come to Washington, D.C. to find this out.
Well, Mr. Dorsey, let me turn to you, and then I'll wrap it up. Let the ranking member.
Sure.
You were at the Bear site that night, correct?
Yes, sir.
I'd like to show you a slide of a PowerPoint. It's in tab number 5 there if you want.
Yes,
If
sir.
Mr. Carper wants to give you that. It's a PowerPoint presentation Bear officials created 3 days after the incident. You can find it at tab number 5.
Okay.
Page 11 of that tab. The title of the slide is Positive Points. The first item on the list reads as follows. Emergency response went very well. No significant complaints from the community and neighbors. But in your testimony, you said you weren't allowed into the plant until after 3 a.m. You said you were only allowed in after a confrontation at the front gate, and even then, you weren't allowed to go to the scene of the explosion until nearly 5 a.m. in the morning. Mr. Dorsey, do you agree with Bear's claim that the emergency response went very well and there were no significant complaints from the communities or neighbors?
Absolutely not. I mean, you've heard the testimony and you have it written before you. In my personal circumstance, I was at the front gate with the State Emergency Response Director, Jimmy Jeanette, and we were attempting to get into the facility. I was talking with my boss, the Secretary of the Department of Environmental Protection. He was speaking with the governor, asking, and the questions were exactly how bad is it, what exactly was released, what is the worry, all the questions you've heard. I went to the front gate and said, look, I need to get in here, and the fellow at the gate said, I'll let you talk to someone on the phone. I said, I'm not leaving until I get into this plant. Mr. Jeanette came up immediately after that and said, if we don't get in here, there's going to be some state troopers show up and start arresting people. So at that point, we were allowed into the plant, and as the other people earlier, we were ushered into a side room away from the main communications center, and Mr. Crosby came in, and Mr. Way, and eventually we made our way to the incident site.
So it was only after threat of arrest that you actually got in then?
Yes, sir.
Well, let me ask you this. In his testimony, Bear's president and CEO states that the only real problem with your emergency response that night was that you didn't receive immediate reassurances that you were safe. Do you agree that you needed reassurances that night, or did you need actual information about what was going on?
We needed real information. As someone stated earlier, the plant's fire department did a good job. That was a major incident, and those fellows did well in there. But it's a dangerous plant. There are miles of piping. There are thousands of tanks. We needed to know what was happening. The governor himself was on the way. It was the 28th was the night of the Democratic National Convention. He flew in, and about 5 o'clock he got there himself. So that was the level of concern that was there that night on the state level, and we just weren't getting what we needed.
Thank you. Mr. Walden, questions, please.
Hey, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Crawford, I want to get at this issue of who is controlling the flow of information inside the plant to outside the plant. And I believe you said that the security guard who was you talked to or others talked to said, this is all I can say. This is, I can only tell you there's an emergency. That's all I'm allowed to say, language such as that. Who is controlling what the security guard was allowed to say? Do we know?
I do not know, sir.
Mr. Carper?
Well,
How does
I
this-
know now because I've talked to them. They've changed their procedures, and
Right.
they didn't have an on-site manager present. Remember now, to some extent, put this in perspective, they've had one heck of a bad explosion.
Right.
They've had at least one death, and turns out two
Right.
deaths. And they're trying to sort through that, and they're trying to assess it. But frankly, Mr. Walden, had I known then what I know right now, I would have ordered an evacuation. I would not have let those
Right.
people stay in that footprint. If I'd have known 100-pound pieces of shrapnel were flying through the air. I specifically asked about the MIC tank.
And what
I
were
was
you
worried
told?
about, well, listen, we get more information on a car wreck than we got that night.
I fully
This was the most
understand
unreported. We were led to believe everything was okay. Obviously, if we'd known that, I think any first responder, a trooper, anybody knowing what that plan has, knowing the damage to that vessel, would have ordered, at least prepared an evacuation, at the very least. We didn't do that.
Okay, so who was telling all these people to keep quiet, in effect, and just say, we've got an emergency, we're dealing with our emergency?
Well, as I understand it, they had basically two command structures in the plant. You'd have to ask them. That's their responsibility.
I'll do that.
And remember, it's a fixed asset industrial plant, so we generally rely upon them to tell us what we have and what we're supposed to do. It's not like a train accident or a commercial.
Well, I guess that's what I'm getting to, is I assume they have an emergency plan. I assume they have protocols. I assume that you all have worked those out together so that when there is an incident, boom, this is what we do. It sounds like there was one in 07. It sounds like they pledged that any communication problems there had been fixed. And now you get to the big one or near big one, and there isn't the communication that is essential in a situation like this.
I can explain what we did right and what we did wrong. I can explain what we've changed, but frankly, I think they'll have to explain their lack of giving us information. But if their position is they gave our 911 center adequate information to make an intelligent decision, I disagree with that.
There's a breakdown, clearly. Mr. Bresland, I want to go to you, and I'm working through your West Virginia accent there. I'm trying to figure out what part of West Virginia that originates in. But I appreciate the work you're doing to try and bring about better and safer plant operations. I want to touch on a couple of things. First of all, I believe you're the one who said there were 3 safety interlocks that were disabled.
Yes, that's correct.
What were those?
Those were safety interlocks that controlled the flow of the methanol solution into the residue treater, and they had been bypassed to allow the temperature to get up to what they consider to be the appropriate temperature for the decomposition of the methanol to take place under normal circumstances. However, in this particular case, they were pumping very concentrated methanol into the reactor. Again, the safety interlocks were bypassed, and you filled the tank with a concentrated solution, which resulted in the explosion.
And how long had these interlocks been disabled?
It's my understanding that on a routine basis, when they were starting up the residue treater, that the interlocks would be bypassed until they got the temperature up to the.
Is that a standard operating procedure then in this?
No.
No,
safety interlocks are there for a reason.
I always believed that when I was dealing with transmitter repair.
There's no logical reason to bypass a safety interlock. You're just putting the facility in danger when you do that.
Then let me ask you this question, because there's a lot of concern among us, and I assume the community and most people observing this. If you have these projectiles flying around and you have the MIC tank nearby,
yes,
and there was this, as I understand it, a safety screen of some sort that was there, did it take a hit? Did any of these projectiles hit that safety screen?
Well, there was a photograph shown earlier on of the safety screen, and it did show some what appeared to be indentation.
I didn't know if that was a design or if that was something that happened during the explosion. Do you know the answer to that?
What my lead investigator says is that was caused by a sagging of the material of the material.
Because of heat?
Probably just because of its age. It had been there for some time.
And do you know, in your evaluation of that safety screen, would it have withstood the force of these projectiles had it taken a direct hit?
Well, we're going to look at a couple of issues there. Number one, what was the design? What were the design criteria for that safety screen? Was it designed to take? Did somebody make an assumption that there could have been a serious explosion, and then it would be hit by projectiles? How strong was it? What strength was it built to prevent those projectiles from impacting the
But
tank.
we don't have an answer to that.
We don't have an
yet.
answer to that. That's part of our continuing investigation.
And the other question I have, I represent a district that has one of the chemical facilities from the Cold War era, and we're in the process of destroying the mustard gas and the nerve agents and all. And I know there's an array of air sensors all around that facility. Could you speak to me about the need for, do you believe in your investigation that there are adequate air sensors either at the plant or outside of the plant and around the perimeter or further out wherever a plume might go?
Well, with a chemical like methyl isocyanate, I think it's very important that you have air sensors that would specifically measure the concentration of methyl isocyanate and allow both the facility and the emergency responders and the community to know.
And are there adequate sensors today from your perspective?
I'll have to wait and hear what the Bayer people have said about what they've done since the investigation. But we were not able to get any information on the adequacy of the...
Why?
My understanding is that they were not working at that time.
The air sensors were not working. All right. And one final question. Just, Mr. Crawford, in terms of the shelter-in-place system and how that works, is there an audible alarm that goes off in the communities to alert people they need to shelter in place? Because this was obviously very late at night. And
Yes, we have, according to our plan, it's you got a ring down system.
Ring down being it actually calls
calls, yeah.
Or people in their homes.
That's
And did that all come off correctly? No.
It was a miserable failure.
Why?
Well, the vendor that sold it to us hadn't scrubbed the system. We did too large of an area. We tried to do it one time. It just couldn't handle that cause. We've since changed the vendor.
And have you run a test of the system since you changed the vendor?
Yes, sir.
And does it work now?
Better. It's still not perfect. It's just part of the tools in the toolbox. We've got EBS, the media, ring down,
Right.
outdoor warning sirens. We've got a good system, but
I
you've got
would-
to know to hit the button. You've got
No,
to
I
control.
understand, but I would encourage you to do the test because we ran through this same problem when they were ramping up the same sort of alert systems out in my district for this decommissioning the chemical plant, and they had false alarms that like put the signs up on the freeway to flee. I mean, it's a little problematic in the
We
beginning.
now have what's called a handshake system on our sirens that, thanks to Congress, Homeland Security money, we actually can know when a siren goes off. We do routine tests of all these
Right.
things. But again, we've got cable interrupt, but you've got to have the television set on.
Well, that's
You've
my
got ring
point.
down.
The ring down and the audible alarm systems are really critical in the middle of the night.
And somewhat limited, but very effective in the Institute area.
And I know the cable intercept, that's one of the things that was identified in the after-action review and the critique.
Cable
reaching out-
intercept as in the emergency alert system used by
With
your
the cable company.
system?
With
And
the cable.
did the emergency alert system work? Both radio, TV, and cable?
There was a glitch in that, I believe.
How
we had
so? What was
Well-
the breakdown there?
Well, we've got different cable companies. We've got
Right.
some problem with that. I think we've got our EBS, our emergency broadcast, now working pretty well. But remember, they're just part of the way to warn people.
No, I understand, but we want them to everywhere.
We want them to work.
We want them to
sir.
all work.
Yes,
So,
they
all
should
right.
work every time. Yes,
Yeah,
sir.
I'm sorry. Thank you. My time's expired.
Ms. Sutton for questions, please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for your very informative testimony. In the next panel, we will hear from Bayer CropScience President and CEO William Buckner. But I want to share with you a portion of his prepared testimony and get your reactions to it. After the August 2008 explosion, the Chemical Safety Board received thousands of pages of documents from Bayer about its plant's operations. In February, more than 4 months after the accident, Bayer informed CSB that many of these documents contain sensitive security information, or SSI, as we've heard here today. And under law, SSI cannot be disclosed to the public. So let's look at why Bayer took this position, according to the testimony of Mr. Buckner. He admits that his company initially hoped to use SSI to avoid responding to the Chemical Safety Board's request for information about the plant's large stockpile of MIC. When that failed, Bayer tried to invoke SSI to block discussion of MIC with the general public. So, Mr. Bresland, in your experience at the CSB, has any other company ever tried to withhold documents from the board under the guise of Homeland Security?
Well, we've been in operation since around 2001, 2002, and we've completed approximately 55 major investigations. This is the first time that we've been exposed to this issue where someone came in and said, all of the documents that we have submitted to you, you're eligible to receive them and look at them, but you can't tell anybody else about them. And when we, for example, when we look at the list of some of the documents that they told us we couldn't tell anything, incident, near miss, and environmental release reports, these are basically public documents, operator training records. I just could not understand how these would be considered security related. To me, I worked in the chemical industry for 35 years. I ran chemical plants. I know how they work. I know the difference between security and process safety. And the documents that they were asking to be considered as SSI were not security documents. They were process safety documents. The sort of documents that we, on a routine basis, get from all of the companies that we investigate, and we routinely get them cooperatively from the companies, and then we use those documents in our reports. Now we're having a public meeting in West Virginia on Thursday evening, and we have a PowerPoint presentation that's going to give a lot of information about what happened at this accident, much more than we had time to present today. There will be no SSI in that. We worked with the Coast Guard. They took out one item from our PowerPoint presentation. Everything else is what we would normally present. However, if we have to go and look at 2,000 documents, or in the case of our BP Texas City accident, where we got 6 million documents, if we have to look through, say, 20% of those, 1 million documents, we might as well pack up and go home, because there's no way that we can do these investigations under these circumstances.
Thank you very much, Mr. Bresland. And if I may continue, Mr. Buckner, in his testimony says, quote, "We frankly admit," end quote, "that one of his company's goals was to," quote, "avoid making the controversial chemical MIC part of the public debate during the incident," end quote. He further acknowledged there were, of course, some business reasons that also motivated our desire for confidentiality. These included a desire to limit negative publicity, generally about the company or the Institute facility, to avoid public pressure to reduce the volume of MIC that is produced and stored at Institute by changing to alternative technologies, or even calls by some in our community to eliminate MIC production entirely. So, Mr. Dorsey, I would shift to you. We've examined the statute and regulations at issue here, and nowhere can we locate a provision allowing a company to conceal information in order to limit negative publicity. That is not a proper basis to label something as SSI, is it?
Not in my opinion, no, Congresswoman. And as I touched on briefly in my testimony, there are a number of laws out there, federal and state also, that require the submission of information on processes, waste streams, et cetera, which could at least potentially be covered under these types of claims. And I think that's completely, that was not what was intended by the coverage under that type of statute.
And yet, Mr. Buckner acknowledges that public discussions and CSB recommendations about alternate technologies and inventory amounts would be a sensitive matter for the company. And he concludes, quote, "We concede that our pursuit of SSI coverage was motivated in part by a desire to prevent the public debate from occurring in the first place," end quote. And if I could just shift very quickly, I know I'm running out of time, but Ms. Nixon, I know that you've been involved with the safety of chemical plants in West Virginia for 2 decades. Is that correct?
Yes, it is.
Have you ever heard anything like this? The president of Bayer basically admitting in his testimony that his company was abusing this process in order to prevent the public debate about MIC. What do you think about that?
I've never heard anything like that. I do know that 1 month after the incident occurred last year, the community group, People Concerned About MIC, held a forum in Institute. And at that time, the company refused to attend their meeting. They waited another month to hold a meeting of their own. So, and even with that, we still haven't been given the information as to what was in the plume or the health risks that the community may have been exposed to.
Do you have an opinion about what should happen to a company for doing this?
Many in the community, I can tell you, would like for the company to stop producing the chemicals. Some would like the company to close. I would like the company to be a safe company, to eliminate the production of MIC so closely to a university and to communities that are surrounding it. As I said, it only takes about less than 15 minutes for a plume to engulf the communities of Institute and across the river in Jefferson and St. Albans.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Sutton. Mr. Burgess, for questions, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And just continuing on that thought for a minute, Mr. Carper, you may not be the correct person for me to ask this, but historically, how has this evolved that there's such close proximity with neighborhoods and institutions of higher learning?
Kanawha County, Charleston, West Virginia, one time was the chemical center of the world. We had over 50 to 70,000 chemical jobs from one end of the county to the other. West Virginia is blessed with natural resources. We've got good water. It was just Union Carbide started there, and the chemical plants flourished. And West Virginia State University at one time was a historically black college. It was built there. The Tuskegee Airmen there. We didn't think about things in those days. Everybody kind of got along, and they just kind of melded into each other.
Now, the storage of the methyl isocyanate,
yes.
Is that something that's been more recent, or is that?
No, they've produced that, and you'd have to ask them statistically when, but that's been a multiple decade activity at that plant. I think it's the only one now existing in the U.S., but you'd have to ask them. I think I'm correct on that.
Well, I guess, and part of this goes back to what Mr. Walden was asking, presumably then recognizing today that we've got in juxtaposition to an institution of higher learning and neighborhoods, a chemical that's been shown to be very, very toxic if it's released all of a sudden. What sort of plans? I mean, do you in the chemical plant work on disaster drills? Do you have an ongoing dialogue?
Well, they might get an F for this response. I'll give them an A+ for that. They're very good about that. They're working with us. We work together quite well with the first responders as far as emergency planning and preparedness. They'll tell you, I suspect that they're in the process right now of doing a drill in the next couple of months. No, they're very cooperative on that. That is not a problem.
And just one last question, and this is just for background information. I'm not meaning to infer anything by it. How many jobs are at this plant? What is the economic impact to the community? Is
it's significant. They'll tell you, I think just in the Larvin unit, I think they have about 140 some, but it's better for that to come from them. Listen, these are West Virginia workers. These are good, safe workers with a long history in Kanawha County and West Virginia of producing necessary chemicals safely.
Right, and I appreciate that point. Certainly in our Texas City area, where the long history of refining, similar environment. Now, Mr. Bresland, you said that you could provide us with a list of the products of decomposition from the fire of the methamill that was released, and you will do that?
Yes, and I don't know if we gave you the most up-to-date PowerPoint presentation, but in our presentation.
Do we have that information?
In our presentation on Thursday night, we do list those chemicals, and we can certainly, if is that
okay. So and
it is in the PowerPoint presentation that I have here.
Okay, and that's part of our records. I don't know that I have that. But it's not urgent that I have it right now, but I would like to see what the compounds are we're talking about. Well, what's next? What's next from your perspective? You have a hearing or meeting Thursday night?
We have a meeting on Thursday night, and it's being held at West Virginia State University. And there will be a presentation by our investigators to the community, and we've invited the whole community to attend this meeting. And there will also be a panel discussion when we've got some of the local emergency responders, some of the people who are here.
So your intended audience is the community?
Yes. And the purpose of that meeting is twofold. One is to tell the community, here's what we have discovered so far, and also hear from the community what are their concerns or issues with this incident and our investigation.
Looking at this list, I can almost imagine what their concerns would be. These are some fairly toxic. These are the products, the byproducts of burning methamil that I'm looking at on page 37. Methamil thermal decomposition.
Yeah, but
hydrogen cyanide, methyl isocyanate.
I think I've got a different. Yeah, I have them here. Yeah. Acetonitrile dimethyl disulfide, hydrogen cyanide, methyl thiocyanate, methyl isocyanate.
Yeah, I can imagine what their concerns are going to be. Now, at this point, I don't know that we've established whether the sensitive security information argument is correct or not, but are there going to be issues surrounding sensitive security information that are going to be discussed at your meeting?
Our meeting, we plan to tell the public, here's what happened in the incident. We don't plan on getting into too much of a discussion of SSI because, at least in terms of our PowerPoint presentation, we've reached agreement with the Coast Guard on what is SSI, and when we sent
so you have
we sent it to them.
Okay.
And they said there's one issue that we would not like you to disclose, and that was the time of day at which the methyl isocyanate was transferred within the facility.
Okay. Just in general, with having dealt with this problem and the issues about sensitive security information, I mean, has this? I'm assuming it has hindered your work so far. Do you see it? Is that an accurate assumption on my part? And do you see it as continuing to hinder your ability to do this investigation going forward?
Don't take this the wrong way. It's a less than accurate assumption because it has just about killed us. We've spent a lot of our time dealing with in a very cooperative manner with the Coast Guard, but we internally within our agency, and we only have 37 people. We're a small agency. The team that has been doing the investigation has been tied up with this. The same team is investigating a major explosion at a sugar refinery in Georgia that killed a number of people. That investigation has basically been put on hold until we resolve this issue. It has really taken up a lot of our time. I keep getting calls from the news media about this, doing interviews. We're dealing with it. I don't want to underestimate this at all. It has taken up a lot of our time.
And do you have an opinion as far as going forward? Is this now something that is quickly going to be resolved, do you think, after this today? Or
well, my fervent hope is that once we get past today, we'll be able to move ahead. But I worry about when we publish our final report, which is typically 100, 150 pages long, and it's a highly technical report with lots of information. We'll send that to the Coast Guard, and they'll review it also. Will they come back? We'll be going back and forth with this issue when we do our final report. I do worry about that.
As part of your investigation, do you involve yourself at all as to whether or not there is adequate security surrounding the plant? If there's sensitive security information that it is better not get out in the public domain, is there a robust enough security around the plant to protect it from the type of damage that we might want to prevent someone from knowing about?
Well, as someone who worked in the chemical industry for many years, we're obviously concerned about security, but we don't get involved in evaluating the security at the facility. We don't feel that we're qualified to do that. We leave that to the experts, who would be either Homeland Security or the Coast Guard in this case.
Okay. Thank you.
Chair recognizes himself for 5 minutes. One of the reasons why this is such an important conversation is because it's easy to understand why the citizens of Kanawha County are angry and frustrated. The Huffington Post reported on Sunday, West Virginia chemical plant shut down, fined $2 million over emissions. State and federal authorities announced Monday that DuPont and Lucite International have agreed to pay $2 million to settle air pollution violations at a West Virginia plant. The violations stem from sulfur dioxide releases from a sulfuric acid unit owned by Lucite, but operated by DuPont at its Bell plant in Kanawha County. This announcement said Lucite voluntarily agreed to close the unit by next April. Mr. Carper, this gets back to the point you were raising early, Ms. Nixon, and that is these take away jobs. And I assume that this county in West Virginia has a high unemployment rate like many other counties in this country. And when you aren't a responsible corporate citizen and these plants get shut down, it affects people's livelihoods. And that's why I want to follow up on your earlier conversation, Ms. Nixon, about frustration and anger that this was happening again. And I want to talk about the history of prior accidents. The committee's investigation has determined that August 28th accident was not an isolated incident. The Institute plant has a long history of chemical accidents and failures to provide timely and actionable information to the public and first responders, both during the explosion and after. On December 28th of 2007, just 8 months before, a chemical reaction caused a release at the Larvin unit. Baer's own internal documents characterize the event as a decomposition incident. In plain English, dangerous chemicals escaped. On August 13th, 2001, shortly before Baer took over, 10 workers received medical treatment from a chloroform leak at the Aventus portion of the Institute plant. In all, there have been as many as 11 chemical accidents at the plant dating back to 1985. Ms. Nixon, since you've lived through a number of these chemical incidents, have you ever been personally harmed by a chemical accident at the plant?
Yes, August the 11th, 1985, when they had a release of aldocarboxene, methylene chloride.
Could you turn your microphone on, please?
Yes, on August the 11th, 1985, when there was a release of aldocarboxene and methylene chloride, there were 135 of us that ended up in emergency rooms. And when I say of us, I was one of them that ended up in emergency rooms there.
What does this pattern of incidents that I just recited tell us about how confident we should be about Baer's commitment to being able to prevent another major chemical event at this plant?
Well, there seems to be some sort of inherent process defect in the way that that the process goes on, that it continually occurs in this facility, at least in the insecticide part of the plant.
And one of the things that concerns the committee is that the investigation has shown that there's not just a pattern of chemical accidents, there's also a pattern of accidents in which the community has demanded information from the company that was not forthcoming. For example, in a letter from Baer to the EPA after the December 2007 incident, and this is at tab 27, if we can pull that up, the company admitted the following. Baer CropScience is aware that area officials were frustrated with their inability to answer all questions that were being asked. We agree that Institute and Metro 911 can and should communicate more efficiently and quickly. Baer acknowledged that they could do better, but the August episode has shown they have not lived up to their own promise. Ms. Nixon, you concluded your testimony by saying that the Institute residents have lost confidence in Baer CropScience. What role has Baer's continuing failure to provide adequate information to the community played in that loss of confidence?
As I said, the company is in such close proximity to the community that whenever there's a release, it only takes minutes for it to get into the community. And the lack of communication has caused a lot of concern among the community residents on what they've been exposed to from the chemicals that were released.
Mr. Carper, you used a phrase that is very common to a lot of us, and that's the question of good faith.
Yes, sir.
One of your colleagues, Mr. Dale Petrie, who's director of the Office of Emergency Services for the Kanawha County Commission, told members of the committee staff that it is a matter of building trust every time the plant has changed hands. So I ask you, how is Baer going to regain your trust and the trust of your emergency personnel who selflessly serve in your community?
Mr. Braley, I don't know if I can give you a clear answer on that. I think they are trying. I have met with Mr. Crosby, the plant manager, a number of times. They'll tell you that they're making changes. They're bringing in a full-time safety person. They're going to do a drill. They're going to do outreach to the community. But, you know, when they use, I think part of their biggest problem now is this SSI thing. I mean, they're giving that acronym a bad name. And they really, if I was the Social Security Administration, I'd make them quit using it. It really sends the wrong message. And the fact that they're the very first company to ever do this, the fact that Congress, who wrote the law, says it doesn't apply, I mean, maybe they ought to find something else to do with their time and invest in rebuilding community trust. And they have to have a transparent process. The community has to believe that they actually know the risk. That takes a long time. Mr. Petrie's here with me. He's got 25 plus years in the fire service. He's our emergency manager. He nailed that correctly. The plan has changed a lot, but they do have to rebuild trust, and that's not going to be an easy thing to do.
Chief Crawford, have you ever heard the phrase actions speak louder than words?
Yes, sir, I have.
You've seen a lot of policies down on paper in your life, I assume.
That is correct.
It's one thing to have those policies on paper. It's another thing to act like you believe in them. Would you agree with that?
Yes, sir, I would.
Is that the type of commitment you're looking from Bayer? Is a demonstrated proof that they really have an action to commit to carrying these policies forward to protect the citizens of your community?
Yes, sir, I do. And I think the common thing is we want to do what's right, whether it's from a first responder's point of view of making a decision to a plant manager making those decisions. We need to do what's right and be responsible. I mean, we're all held accountable. We need to be responsible, and that's the bottom line.
Thank you. Chair now recognizes a gentlewoman from the Virgin Islands for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And before I ask my question, there's an extensive body of evidence that toxic plants are more likely to be located near minority communities. And so I asked for the demographics of Kanawha County and was told 91% white, 8% black, 1% other. But I see that if you look at the closer in picture, and we've heard from Mr. Carper that it's largely a minority community. I consider students at a university to be a particularly vulnerable population. So, Ms. Nixon, do you know if there was any specific information given? We know that the general community and the public safety officials didn't get much, but was there any kind of communication specifically to West Virginia State?
Okay, as you'll note, the incident occurred August the 28th, 2008. This is the beginning of the year for the students at West Virginia State University. They had gone through orientation. They had heard this information, but they'd heard this about shelter in place and chemical plant being there, along with all the other information that they receive as new students on campus. This was on a hot evening in August. The students were outdoors, and that's when the explosion occurred. And they're close to the plant.
I see that now.
Yeah, and they did receive information during orientation, but it takes drills and things before it's
but
actually.
But no specific information that evening.
I believe some of the dormitory captains or whatever they're called did advise their residents to go inside and shelter in place, but some students, you know,
and that was
out
done on
campus.
their own, pretty much as
that was on their own.
Police chief
yes.
did.
Mm-hmm.
And although we don't know specifically what chemicals might have been in the air, have you seen any public health activity in the area, surveying individuals? We, heard some of the kinds of symptomatology from some of the possible chemicals. Has there been any public health activity surveying the population?
I do know that the Kanawha County Poison Control Center was very frustrated with the lack of information that they had received also. That was brought out at one of the critique meetings that was held in the Kanawha Valley. I haven't seen the question that people had about their gardens and whether they should eat from there. there was no direct information coming from the plant when the plant manager was asked that. All he said was, well, you usually wash your garden plants before you eat them.
So,
And there had been reports of residue being on the plants after the incident.
and we've heard, and you mentioned the bill that Governor Manchin got passed this year, and it requires that businesses report industrial incidents. The incident was reported. There was just no specific information on which to make a determination to inform and protect the public. From what you know of the bill, do you think it goes far enough? It requires notification, but I haven't seen the bill. Does it satisfy you? You've said you can't rely on the company. Does this bill reassure you, and does, in talking to the public feeling more protected?
Now, I haven't had a chance to review the whole bill, and because it was just passed this session, this spring. And here it is, April, and I'm here, so I haven't had a chance to review the full content of the bill.
Thank you. Mr. Bresland, before I ask the question, Bayer is the only company in the United States that makes and stores large amounts of MIC, as we understand it. And I'd like to show a photograph of the section of the Bayer plant where the explosion occurred. It should come up on the screen, photo CSB 22. The tank, I think that Mr. Walden's line of questioning and your responses have already determined that the residue tank could have gone just as easily in the other direction and into the MIC tank. And if that 2-ton residue tank had blasted into the MIC tank, it's possible that MIC would have been released into the surrounding communities, correct?
That's correct. And in this photograph, the accident takes place in the sort of middle right of the photograph, and the MIC tank is on the tank that's marked on the left-hand side.
Mm-hmm. And this wasn't the first explosion in this facility, as we've heard, and we regret the loss of life, and extend our sympathies to the families as well. But also in 1993, there was another explosion. So my question is, why in the world is Bayer putting the community at risk by storing large amounts of this deadly chemical in a tank that's vulnerable to these kind of accidents? MIC doesn't need to be stored in that way. There are safer alternatives that exist. We had a near miss in August, but we might not be as lucky next time. As part of the report, will CSB make a recommendation as to whether Bayer should adopt alternative technologies that do not require storage of large amounts of MIC?
After the Bhopal incident in 1984, there were at least two major manufacturers of MIC. One was DuPont, and one at that time was Union Carbide. DuPont, within a very short period of time, switched their process to a type of process that ultimately gave the same product, which was a similar product to the one that's been made at Institute, but they switched their process to one in which MIC was formed but immediately used. So there wasn't any, or there is, and that operation that facility is still there. So they are manufacturing MIC, but there's only a very a minute amount that is stored.
Are you going to make a recommendation in your report that?
We're certainly going to make a recommendation that Bayer explain to us what would the issue be that would prevent you from doing this. And obviously there is a technical capability. I don't know if that capability, it belongs to DuPont. I don't know if that's available to other manufacturers. And then there would be an economic evaluation that they would have to do as well. But certainly keeping in mind the community interest in this, I'm sure that Bayer will be actively moving in this direction to look at this and come up with an evaluation. And that would certainly be a recommendation that we would make.
Thank you. My time is up, and I have to go to the floor, but I'll try to return.
Thank you. Well, let me follow up on that, if I may. Are you familiar with a report reducing the storage of methyl isocyanate at the Institute of West Virginia? It was a 1994 report, November 12th, 1994, by the community groups put it together. Are you familiar with that report at all?
I know the report has been written. I haven't read it.
Because again, this report is 15 years ago, and it was after Bhopal. And in the report, it says that the plant may be a disaster waiting to happen. And they talk about a 1993 incident in which there were numerous points of neglect by the company management, including a company-wide yield enhancement program that accelerated production outputs at the plant without ensuring adequate safety reviews. Looks like we sort of have the same thing here with we have a new residue treater being there. We have it jury-rigged or bypass system put on it, so the safety valves, interlocking safety valves, you don't have any monitors, air monitors, video cameras. Seems like we have the same thing. Because it says here that a worst-case MIC release at the plant could cause deaths for a 9-mile radius and injuries for up to 28 miles from the plant. And I went on and read this report, and it said the plant here at Institute, Virginia, stores 3 times more than actually was released in Bhopal. And as to your point, they went on to say that DuPont to do a no storage continuous feed system. Whether they need that day, they produce it, they use it, so you're not storing this MIC chemical. And the Israeli firm have found different ways of making the same product with different materials, avoiding the use of MIC entirely. Again, this is 15 years ago. I'm sure science have progressed in 15 years. What is the purpose of using MIC then? I mean, if that's what might be one of your recommendations, why would you need to use this dangerous chemical?
Well, I think
store at such large volumes.
The issue is, I think, is more the amount that's stored at the facility. Is there a way to make it and use it immediately? I used to run a large chemical plant in Philadelphia, and we had a major explosion. And as a result of that, we did away with the storage of the particular chemical that caused that explosion. And we were able to, and I was a little skeptical about it when it happened, but that plant has been running very successfully ever since it was rebuilt without the storage of this dangerous material.
So you could just use a day's supply, produce it, use it?
We didn't store any at all. We just zapped it on through, just went straight from one process unit to another.
Let me just ask one question, and if Mr. Walton has any, we'll follow up, go next panel. This blast blanket, there seems to be some controversy whether or not it's gone, as we said in our opening statement, but we just received an email saying that maybe part of it's still at the plant. After an accident like this occurs, you're in charge, right, the Chemical
Yes.
Safety Board? So if they would remove this blast curtain or blanket, they would have to ask you, right, to remove it?
That would be my assumption, that they would ask us, if you're removing a particular piece of equipment that is involved, or at least peripherally involved in the incident.
So if part of it's still in the plant, you'd be interested in your investigation of seeing this blast mat or blast blanket around the MIC.
Oh, sure, absolutely, we would be.
And you haven't seen it since then, or since this investigation commenced?
Let me ask our... We have had an opportunity to look at it since it was taken down.
Okay, very good. I have another question. Mr. Walton? Ms. Sutton, Mr. Burgess? I'm afraid to ask Mr. Burgess because I know, but no, go ahead, Mike.
Yeah, Mr. Bresland, I just have one last question on the heater, I guess, that you described, and the bypassing of the safety mechanism. Do you have an idea as to how long that heater had been defective?
Well, it wasn't that the heater was defective. It was that during the startup operation, to allow the temperature to rise to the appropriate temperature for the reaction to take place inside the tank, they had to bypass the 3 safety controls that were there with the purpose of preventing inappropriate reaction.
Well, that to me though suggests that the heater wasn't adequate to do the job that it was intended to do.
That's correct.
And so we had to rely on the heat of the chemical reaction to get us up to the ignition or the startup temperature, whatever it would be appropriate there. How long had that? I mean, it just seems like such a I mean, you look for a root cause. We have an inadequate heater where we're having to bypass and use the chemical reaction to make things work. It just defies logic that on something as critical as that you would have a non-functioning apparatus there. I mean, buy a bigger heater, for Christ's sake.
I think Mr. Carper brought up an interesting point here. This facility was Union Carbide, and we'll make in our presentation later this week, we'll show the number of different owners that the facility has had. Every time you change corporate ownership, you probably bring in new management, new cultures, new safety cultures, new ways of operating things, and this can be confusing for the employees. It could be confusing for the community. One set of management might have an approach that we're really going to work closely with the community. Another set of management might say, well, we don't really need to deal with them too much. I think that's an issue that, that may not be exactly involved in this incident, but when I see a facility in which ownership is changing, it raises some questions in my mind that could be an issue.
So just then in brief answer to the question, the inadequate heating element likely predated the ownership of
Bayer.
Of Bayer.
It probably was back there right when this particular facility was built, when this particular when this particular operation was built.
Okay.
So it may have been there for years and years.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Well, thank you. And let me thank this panel for your testimony today and your interest, and we'll continue to work with you and hopefully get some legislative changes made. But thank you very much for your testimony.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And Mr. Bresland, you're going to stay with us for the second panel, I take it?
Yes.
Okay. So I won't reintroduce you again as the chairman of the U.S. Chemical Safety and Hazard Investigation Board, but you can stay.
Do you want me to do my presentation again as well?
Only if you wish.
No, it's okay.
Well, we'll call up our second panel of witnesses. Rear Admiral James Watson, who's the Director of Prevention Policy for Marine Safety, Security, Stewardship of the U.S. Coast Guard. Mr. William Buckner, who's the President and CEO of Bayer CropScience LP. Mr. Nick Crosby, who's Vice President, Institute Site Operations for Bayer CropScience. And Mr. John Bresland, of course, is going to stay with us. Okay, it's the policy of the subcommittee to take all testimony under oath. Please be advised that you have the right under the rules of the House to be advised by counsel during your testimony. Do you wish to any of you wish to be represented by counsel during your testimony? Mr. Buckner, you got counsel? Okay. Would you want to, just for the record, identify them? You would have to answer questions, but at any time during questioning, if you want to stop and consult with your counsel, you're allowed to. Okay. Mr. Arnett, very good. Okay, I'm going to ask you, please rise, raise your right hand, and take the oath. Mr. Bresland, you don't have to. You're still under oath from last one. Do you swear or affirm the testimony you're about to give to be the truth, the whole truth, nothing but the truth, the matter pending before this committee? Let the record reflect the witnesses have replied in the affirmative. They are now under oath. We'll begin with a 5-minute opening statement. Admiral, would you like to go first? If you just want to pull that up, press that button, get that green light on, we'll be ready to go.
Yes, sir. Thank you very much. Good afternoon, Mr. Chairman and distinguished members of the committee. Thank you for the opportunity to provide this testimony on the Coast Guard's role and response related to the incident at the Bayer CropScience facility in Institute, West Virginia. I'm Rear Admiral James Watson, Director of Prevention Policy. At the outset, I would like to express my sincere condolences to the families, friends, and community of the 2 plant workers who lost their lives as a result of the explosion and fire. I would also like to underscore the Coast Guard's commitment to cooperate with those responsible for investigating this accident in order to assist partner agencies to help ensure these tragedies are prevented in the future. As a maritime first responder, I know the importance of having accurate information about hazardous chemicals that might be present at waterside facilities and fully support accurate disclosure of this information as required by law, including the disclosure to appropriate emergency preparedness officials under the Emergency Planning and Community Right to Know Act, EPCA. As we also understand the importance of ensuring that safety investigators have access to critical information. That's why we have ensured the U.S. Chemical Safety and Hazardous Investigation Board, CSB, has access to all the information regarding the Bayer CropScience chemical plant in Institute, West Virginia, including information that claim to be security-sensitive information, or SSI. I firmly believe that SSI requirements and EPCRA requirements can coexist for the benefit of the public in the current regulatory framework. As mandated by the Marine Transportation Security Act of 2002, MTSA, and in fulfillment of the Coast Guard's regulatory responsibilities under the Port and Waterways Safety Act of 1972, the United States Coast Guard conducts annual safety and security inspections on over 3,200 regulated waterfront facilities. As the agency with primary responsibility for coordinating maritime security on America's waterways, we also know that public disclosure of certain security-related information can make facilities such as chemical plants more vulnerable to terrorist or nefarious acts or general security breaches. That's why some information is designated SSI. The relationship between the Coast Guard and the CSB in this instance is actually an excellent example of two agencies working together to achieve the appropriate balance between public disclosure of safety details and the protection of SSI. It successfully demonstrates that a balance of safety and security can exist without compromising the mission of either agency. Mr. Chairman and distinguished members of the committee, the August 2008 incident at Bayer CropScience is an unfortunate and tragic event that highlights the importance of ensuring that all agencies responsible for oversight and post-accident investigation of chemical facilities work together in partnership with industry to prevent future accidents and be prepared to respond to incidents that may occur. We will continue to carry out our regulatory responsibilities as we support the Chemical Safety and Hazardous Investigation Board's investigation of the incident at Bayer CropScience. Thank you for your opportunity to provide this testimony on the Coast Guard's role and response. I'm happy to answer the questions.
Thank you, Admiral. Mr. Buckner, your opening statement, please, sir. You want to pull that mic forward and turn on the green light there?
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and good afternoon to everybody. My name is Bill Buckner, and I'm the President and CEO of Bayer CropScience, LP. With me today is Mr. Nick Crosby, who's the site manager at our Institute site. On August 28, 2008, we had a tragic accident at the Institute that claimed the lives of two of our colleagues at our facility. We are all saddened by this loss. We also regret that the community did not promptly receive assurance that it was not in danger. Over the last 7 months, we have been working with several agencies to examine this incident, to learn from it, and to improve our performance, both to prevent another such accident and to improve our emergency communications. Our initial communications with Metro 911, while well-intentioned, inadvertently created confusion and concern. Under our emergency response plan, further information about the explosion should have been provided to Metro 911 in a timely manner. Throughout the incident, our emergency responders did an excellent job under very difficult circumstances. Within a few minutes, the Institute's community fire chief was at our facility and in direct contact with our incident commander's team and Metro 911. Our Emergency Operations Center subsequently opened several additional lines of communication to Metro 911. When our incident commander determined that the circumstances warranted a shelter in place for the two nearby communities, we immediately communicated that recommendation to Metro 911. Again, however, we recognize that the initial communications contributed to confusion. That was never our intention, and we will do better. We have established new procedures. We have established dedicated radio and telephone lines to Metro 911. We have hired a new emergency services leader, and we have provided new real-time chemical monitoring technology to Metro 911. We have received questions about whether the chemical MIC was released into the community during the incident. Let me assure you, we monitor for this, and there was no indication that MIC was released the night of August 28th. Our control room operators continually monitored the MIC day storage tank in the affected unit. Our incident commander monitored the tank and noted that it was not compromised nor in danger of being compromised. Our Emergency Operations Center and incident commander employed air monitoring technology and detected no potentially harmful chemical emissions that might threaten the community. Most important, the multiple layers of protection in place to protect the MIC day tank storage function as intended, and it worked. There have been reports about the CSB's investigation to the effect that our company used the law protecting sensitive security information, or SSI, to restrict the scope of the investigation. This was the first time that CropScience had ever considered the issue of SSI in the context of a federal or state investigation. It is our understanding that it was also the first time that the CSB and the Coast Guard had confronted these issues in this context. As our experience demonstrates, there is need for further education and guidance regarding the interplay between the SSI regulations and CSB investigations. As explained in my written statement, we had various reasons for wanting to limit public discussion of these issues. For about 1 week in January 2009, there were some in our company who thought that the Maritime Transportation Security Act could be used to withhold certain information to the CSB regarding aspects of our MIC operations that were not involved in the accident. 1 week later, after getting further advice, we understood that the company could not deny the CSB access to this information, only that the law might prevent the CSB from disclosing certain of this information publicly. The company sought guidance from the U.S. Coast Guard officials to determine whether our understanding of the law was correct. We were told it was. CropScience did not withhold information from CSB on the ground that it was SSI. SSI information was provided to the CSB. We complied with the law and we cooperated with the CSB and the Coast Guard. In closing, we welcome the opportunity to participate in this hearing. We are proud of our company, our employees, and our community. Mr. Chairman, we stand ready to answer your questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Crosby. Opening statement.
I have no opening statement, Mr. Chairman. I will stay with the statement made by Mr. Buckner.
Okay, thank you. Then we'll go right to questions. Mr. Buckner, Exhibit 26 there in the book right there, that's our document book there. In there is some of the documents that Mayor was going to make under SSI. And two of them sort of caught my eye because I'm trying to figure out something here. Was the responsibility you had to let people know what chemical may have possibly been in that toxic cloud. So on page 13, it's BC D10-004. It's around the top there. It's a copy of the BCS incident report for the exposure involving the MIC equipment for the accident that occurred in late September of 2008. Include this response associated procedures or protocols for working involving process line equipment, opening, particularly on equipment. Is there anything in there, anything in your policies that tell you that you have to tell the emergency response people what kind of fire they may be fighting? On the next page, if you will, that's page 13. On page 14, we're on the only document in there, indicates any MIC equipment installed on or near the Larvin unit. Information shall include but not be limited to maximum inventories, emergency dump tanks, deluge systems, spill containment, refrigeration system, backup power, area detection alarms. Include a copy of the most PHA and all the emergency procedures. So do you have any procedures at all in the company that you're supposed to communicate with emergency personnel if a fire or something occurs?
Yes, sir, we do have these procedures, and I'd like to refer this question, if I could, please,
Sure.
to Mr. Crosby, who's got the background on this statement.
Were these procedures in place on August 28th, 2008?
We have a number of procedures that we use for communicating with our outside responders.
Okay, so why didn't you tell the emergency response or Metro 911 what was in that cloud, or which is suspected to be in the cloud that night?
We have a very experienced and 24/7 incident commander on our site. That commander is on site 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year.
Well, with all that experience, he'd be able to make a decision. He'd be able to tell you what might possibly be in that cloud, could he not?
He did. He was high.
Then why didn't you tell the communities and the emergency responders?
He was highly trained, sir. He went to the scene of the...
Right, but my question is, why didn't you tell him? I'm sure he's highly trained. I'm sure he's an expert. I'm sure he had an idea what was in that cloud, the 3 to 4 miles that was drifting over Nitro and rest of the area, and with the university right up to your fence line. Why wouldn't you let people know what they were facing?
He made the decision, based upon his observation of the incident, that there were no toxic chemicals being released from...
How did he make that determination with his expertise and his knowledge? Because your monitors weren't working.
We have fence line monitors which were working on that.
But on the west side, you had no monitors. They were not working.
The incident commander, he summed up, he used his experience as any firefighter would in that particular situation, sir, and he drew the conclusion, and we believe the conclusion that was right, that there were no...
Let us assume for a moment he was right. Then why wouldn't you tell, if it wasn't a problem, why wouldn't you tell the emergency firefighters what it was?
Our objective is to communicate to our firefighters and our emergency response center. There were two parts to that.
Right, you're supposed to communicate with them. Aren't you supposed to communicate them what the chemicals...
Yes, we are.
So why didn't you do it that night?
Because basically the security guard who was accountable for relaying that message, he became overwhelmed by the incident, and he failed to relate information correctly to 911 in a timely manner.
So you're saying you told the security guy and he failed to do it?
No, I'm the site leader. I'm
right.
the guy that's accountable for what goes on the Institute site.
So why didn't you tell him what chemicals might possibly be in that cloud?
Because we didn't believe there were any chemicals in that cloud.
Well, why did you issue then, in your plant, shelter in place for all your employees? So if it's not dangerous to the outside community, why was it dangerous to your employees where you'd put a shelter in place right after the thing exploded?
The initial assessment of the incident indicated that there were no toxic chemicals being released.
Then why do a shelter in place?
Sorry, and that was validated by one of the volunteer fire department chiefs who arrived at the fence line of our site.
Sure. No danger, then why do a shelter in place for your employees?
As the incident
seems to be a contradiction.
As the incident progressed, what happened, sir, was that our incident commander became concerned because he felt that some nearby storage bins were potentially being compromised by the fire. They were starting to heat up, and so he ordered a precautionary shelter in place for part of the area.
Why didn't you tell the community that then?
Excuse me?
Why didn't you tell the community that?
We passed the information through to Metro 911. We make the recommendations in place, and then Metro 911 inform the community.
Yeah, but all due respect, if you read the Metro 911, they constantly say, this is all I'm allowed to tell you. Basically, I know, but I can't tell you. That was Mr. Breck, was it? Or who's the gentleman at the...
This was the security guard who was initially on the gate and made the initial calls to Metro 911.
Right, and every time they asked, every time Metro 911 called, it was like, oh, I can't tell you. This is all I can tell you. I'm not allowed. They wouldn't even tell them if the Lavin unit was damaged or if the chemicals were coming from there. All he was told is, this is all I can tell you. We have an emergency.
Chairman,
all I can tell you, we have an emergency. Sure.
If I could, please.
Sure.
We acknowledge fully that we had a breakdown in these communications. It's my responsibility to make sure that these don't happen again. I think we have the process in place to ensure that it doesn't happen again.
Sure, but you even said, Mr. Buckner, in your opening statement that their lack of communication was inadvertent and it was confusion. Here's what you're telling Bear CropScience. This is Steve at the main gate who was communicating from Mr. Crosby. Mr. Crosby's deal with Steve, and Steve would say, well, I can't give out any information. Like I say, we'll contact you with the proper information. Now, this was at 22:39 hours. 22:42 hours, 3 minutes later. Well, I can't give out any information until I get my information. Here he is at 23:15. What it is, we have an emergency at Bear CropScience plant, and the only information I can give you is that you will need, you might want to alert the community. My supervisor informed me to tell you, alert the community, there's an emergency in the plant right now. It goes on. At 23:34, my instructions are to tell you to keep the community alerted, and we're responding to the emergency. Even at 5:55 in the morning, the only thing they told the 911 was, we have an emergency. God, we all knew that. It blew up. We heard it. Right. We saw the fire. We knew it was an emergency. Why don't you tell them something more?
It's my understanding, Chairman Stupak, that communications had been established. We'd established through the Emergency On-Site Control Center with the Metro 911.
You're talking, but you're not saying anything to the community that needs to know. How about these kids right there, right next, right on your fence line? Don't they think they had a right to know?
Sure. And I've acknowledged the fact that we had a breakdown in these communications, and now we have policies in place that can correct this situation.
Okay, have you ever told the community yet what chemicals you believe went up in smoke that night in that cloud? Do we know?
As far as our analysis is concerned, the chemicals that were released were consumed in the fire. We're not aware of any toxic chemicals that left the site that evening.
Well, how do you reconcile that with the Chemical Safety Board, which basically says, well, if it's methamil, some of it was burned, some of it was washed away in the fire, some of it evaporated up in the air. That's their preliminary investigation. You're familiar with that, are you not?
I'm not familiar with the absolute details, but we will be attending the hearing with the CSB on Thursday, and I expect to gain more information.
Well, let me help you. Methamil solution sprayed from residue theater, broken pipes and equipment. Some burned in fire. Some remain on ground in nearby equipment. Some might have been carried in the air. And the physical reaction to the exposure, again, nervous system disruption, blurred vision, pinpoint pupils, tremors, muscle twitching, nausea, abdominal pain, respiratory arrest, coma, death, liver damage, anemia. And I think we had 6 firefighters had respiratory problems and nausea, which sounds like there was exposure.
Our analysis shows that there wasn't. When methamil decomposed...
How do you account for the 6 officers, firefighters being second?
We are aware of 2 firefighters who visited our medical center that evening. They were both suffering from heat exhaustion. They were treated and they were released.
You say all your air monitors didn't show anything, but you admit that some of your air monitors were not working, especially those around.
Our fence line air monitors were working that evening.
They were not working, right?
Our fence line air monitors were working that evening.
Right, but not the MIC air monitors, were they?
I'm not aware of that fact.
Wait a minute. You're the incident command officer. You're telling me under oath you have no idea that part of your...
Sorry, I was not the incident.
Okay, you're the on-site person.
Leader.
Okay, now under oath you're telling me you didn't know that part of your monitors, air monitors by the MIC unit was not?
Sorry, at that time, no, I didn't, sir.
Okay, but today, now under oath, you know that part of them were not working, right?
Yes, I'm aware now, yes.
Okay, okay. You're aware your cameras weren't working, right?
I was aware there was a video camera that wasn't working that evening, yes.
Okay. And you're aware you bypassed the interlock safety valves on this retreat vessel, right?
I'm aware of the full findings of the internal investigation.
And you're aware that the computer's training was inadequate?
We respectfully disagree with that comment.
Okay. So you learn all this stuff today, the night you didn't know any of that, the monitors weren't working, the videos weren't working, that you guys had jury-rigged this thing?
As I said at the time of the incident, I wasn't aware that the MIC monitors were not working. I was certainly aware that the monitors were working around the site, and we've certainly completed our full investigation, and we understand now fully the...
Well, when you and your expert decided there was no problem in the air, you must have looked at the monitors. When you looked at the air monitors, you must have realized some of them weren't working. So when you made that decision that night, you didn't have all the information necessary to fully inform the public, did you? Because part of your monitors, you had to realize it that night, because you had to look at the screens, right?
We used the full expertise that we got on that night, sir, that was available to us. I believe that those guys made a proper assessment of the situation. I believe that they drew the right conclusions, and I believe that we made the right decisions.
Mr. Walden, for questions, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Crosby, were you actually at the plant that night when this first happened?
At the point at which the incident occurred, I was actually about 3 hours away. I was attending a West Virginia Business Summit meeting.
Okay. And so you weren't on site at the time of the event. At what point did you take command, or is that the right term?
I arrived on site approximately about 2:30 on the Thursday morning.
So 2:30 on Thursday on the morning. I mean, this is overnight, right? So you're like 3 hours after the explosion,
three to
or
4 hours after the event. Yes.
4 hours. Okay.
Event.
So were you in charge of the incident as you made your way there? If not, who was?
No. What happens is that in the event of an incident, we call our emergency operations center.
Right.
The key role in that operations center was actually that seat was occupied by the production leader who was in charge and accountable for that methanol unit.
Okay, and so who's the production leader? Who was the person in charge since you weren't?
That production leader, the production leader came in and he took charge of the incident.
Right. Who is that?
His name is Rick Clay.
Okay. And I guess.
I believe he has been interviewed by your staff, sir.
Okay. And so he would have been the one overseeing all these decisions at that time because you weren't on site.
I wasn't on site, but he has a team of people that form around him. I mean, typically when if we have an incident like this, we form a team of an emergency response coordination team. And there were 15 to 20 people or more in that room that night, all advising him.
Okay, so I'm sure, well, I would hope you could appreciate our frustration in terms of the breakdown in communication.
Absolutely.
You've alluded to that, Mr. Buckner. I got to tell you, when I hear you use words like well-intentioned but inadvertently caused confusion, I really think that's lawyer speak and really misses the point because if you know, as you heard, I've been in the broadcast business and, you know, it may have been well-intentioned, but it sure doesn't read that way in the transcript. It really reads more like either lack of knowledge or stonewalling, one of the two. And my interpretation is more stonewalling when you have the fellow at the gate saying, I'm not allowed to tell you any more than we have an emergency. And I concur with the chair. I mean, everybody knew that. Mr. Buckner, have you taken an opportunity to meet with the community leaders and the first responder leaders to make sure everybody's on the same page going forward?
No, sir, I haven't.
Is that something you'd be willing to do?
Absolutely.
Because as I watched you testify and watched their reactions, I still think you got a communication problem here. And I mean, I'm not, that's you all to figure out, but I just sense that there's a lot of mistrust right now, and I think if you were in their shoes, you might feel that way.
Could I just say, Congressman?
Yeah, Mr. Crosby.
A huge part of my own personal efforts now is maintaining that, or establishing and maintaining that outreach with our what I would call our local stakeholders. I maintain personal communications with Commissioner Carper, with the folks at Metro 911, with our Congresswoman.
Right.
Congresswoman Capito. I work with the governor. I work with the community councils. It's my accountability, primary accountability to do that, and I'm throwing myself 100% into that.
Yeah, I think that's an important move, no doubt about it. I'm troubled too by the information Mr. Bresland seeks, wants. You've heard his testimony. Correct me if I'm wrong, Mr. Bresland, but I sense from your testimony that you feel there's still an issue here about getting all the information you want, or that you felt that there was a withholding of information that otherwise it did not pose a security risk to share, correct? Am I summarizing that correctly?
Well, we're still concerned about the issue of...
Is your mic on, by the way?
It is on. Yeah.
Okay.
I'll go a little closer. We're still concerned about the issue of sensitive security information, and we still have 2,000 documents that have been stamped SSI by Bear, so we're...
Mr. Buckner, are you familiar with those 2,000 documents stamped as SSI by Bear?
I was familiar with them, yes.
And do you still believe they should be stamped SSI?
We sent this information out to outside legal counsel for their review. We don't believe we're qualified enough to interpret exactly what constitutes SSI in this situation, so we sent all these documents, and it's my understanding that 12% of the documents that we sent over to this outside legal counsel actually were classified as SSI by these individuals.
12%?
12%, that's correct. Or 90%, roughly 88% of them actually were not SSI.
So of those 88% that your outside legal counsel say are not SSI, are you freeing those up then for CSB to have access to?
Absolutely.
Has that happened?
Well, the problem is not allowing CSB to have access. The problem is our use of the documents. We're an agency that prides ourselves on being very public.
Right.
We have public meetings, we have press conferences, we prepare videos. Our issue is, what do we do with these documents that we want to use in our outreach?
Right.
Maybe not the exact document, but certainly information that's in the document. What do we do with that in the future?
And of that,
we're thoroughly confused by this.
All right, let's take that 88% of those documents that they say they don't believe has SSI problems. Is there something else that poses a problem to you for your use of those documents?
No.
Okay,
no,
so those are, you're
fine.
okay.
Yeah.
Everybody's okay on that question.
Yeah.
So it's the remaining 12% that's at issue here. Am I tracking this correctly?
If I If I could, sir. We don't have an issue with the 12%. They've been classified as SSI.
Who classified them as SSI? Your outside counsel?
Our outside counsel.
And does the Coast Guard make that call, whether they're SSI or not?
It's my understanding that's correct.
And have you reviewed these 2,000 documents, Admiral?
No, sir. The Coast Guard has not reviewed any of those documents. The way
have you sought to review them and not gotten them, or how does this process work?
We review documents that are submitted to the Coast Guard, and SSI is a classification that can be applied by any covered person, which is a person that by the law and the regulation is authorized to handle SSI information and sometimes create SSI information, as in the case of Bear. The system is up to them to read the requirements
to decide
for
whether
SSI.
it's classified or not. Is that what you're saying?
I'm sorry.
It's up to Bear to decide what's SSI.
Yes, sir. There's 16 categories that require labeling a document as SSI. These are categories which would cause the information to be transportation security sensitive.
And does anybody external of a company review that decision making? And if so, who is that?
Well,
because otherwise, couldn't somebody just say, "Hey, I don't want all this stuff released, so I think I'll call it SSI," and I get to decide, right?
Here's a perfect example. This is a list of all of the generally a list of all of the documents that have been supplied to us, and every page on this list is marked SSI.
Every page.
Every page.
You know, if you go to tab, I'm told tab 23 and maybe 26 as well, Admiral. In email traffic, a Bear CropScience outside lawyer are instructing OSHA about its obligations to protect sensitive information. And then he instructs OSHA how to do this. Review of SSI as the language of the citations should be liberal, and OSHA should strike any reference to any piece of equipment, piping, or document involving these two chemicals, chlorine and mic. Tab 23.
23.
I'm sorry. Third page in on tab 23.
What paragraph, sir?
Second paragraph. Third paragraph, I'm sorry. So the email, I guess from your outside counsel, is that right, Mr. Buckner?
I haven't seen the document.
Okay, it is.
It's the first time I've seen that document.
Eric Kahn?
Yes, he's with our outside counsel.
And so you haven't seen this document?
No, sir, I haven't.
Okay, it's dated February 23rd. And the third paragraph, accordingly, your review for SSI in the language of the citation should be liberal, and OSHA should strike any references to any piece of equipment, piping, or document involving those two chemicals. You should be particularly cautious about PHA and P&ID references to those chemicals or their interconnectivity to other parts of the unit. Does this make sense? The company dictating what and how to label SSI to a federal agency, Admiral?
Sir, I'm looking at it against the different categories upon which you label something SSI, and it really doesn't fall into any of those categories, in my opinion.
Do the instructions even make sense? I mean, where's the transportation security nexus concerning a piece of equipment or document? Is that what you're saying, that there is no nexus from your quick evaluation?
My quick evaluation, there's no nexus.
So I think this is the public policy question, whether it's Bear or somebody else. If you can have your attorney, you didn't even know they'd done this, tell an agency what to do and what not to do. And here, Admiral, you're the one saying, hey, I don't even see where this fits one of the 16 criteria. And poor Mr. Bresland over here is getting shut down in his ability to use these data points.
Well, earlier in the testimony, or earlier in I think your statements, you mentioned Mr. Buckner's written testimony, in which I understood that he said the reason that they applied the SSI categorization was to slow us down in our investigation and hopefully avoid us having a public meeting. Am I correct in saying that?
I don't believe that was.
Business concern, negative response. Public, it was more, not necessarily slow you down, but. and avoid discussion
I
at
believe,
MIC.
yeah, I believe it's in the submitted testimony, but not what he read this morning.
Correct.
Yeah, which is different.
So there, I just don't understand.
So there's a motive issue here that I think strikes some of us as
Yes,
disconcerting.
that's
to
correct.
say the
Yes.
least. Is that correct, Mr. Buckner? Am I correctly capturing that your submitted testimony is different from what you read today?
Well, I
And
think
I don't know, do we have this submitted here with the language? Where is it? Could we get that? Page 80, you're submitted. Where you say there were several reasons why the company sought confidentiality and SSI protection, including legitimate security concerns, the proper scope of CSB's investigation, and we frankly admit the desire to avoid making the controversial chemical MIC part of the public debate regarding the incident. Now, I wouldn't think in any of those 16 criteria that avoiding public debate is on that list.
No, sir, it's not.
So do you appreciate what Mr. Bresland's getting at here?
I can appreciate the dilemma that we have in understanding SSI and in its context. As I've stated in this particular statement that you referenced, Congressman, we've got two issues that we're dealing with. One is the obligation for us to acknowledge that we can't supply confidential information that may, in fact, be contrary to Homeland Security, the Homeland Security Act. The other is this information that I was made aware of an internal discussion that we had relative to our efforts to keep this from becoming a public issue. That's outside, in my way of thinking, that's outside the scope of the SSI issue.
Right. And I think ours too, which is using SSI to avoid some other discussion by taking a liberal approach in how things get labeled.
Well, again, sir, we supplied that information to our outside counsel. We let them determine what that is. There was a period of time, if I could please, of a span of 1 week roughly, as I mentioned this earlier, to where this internal discussion took place. Once we received the information from our outside counsel, we readily supplied all this information that the CSB had requested.
So this memo we had here from February 23rd of this year, was that within that 1 week period?
No, sir. The 1 week took place previous to that. It was from January 15th up through the latter part of January itself.
So how do you explain this memo then from Eric Kahn that's somewhere toward the end of February that appears to be saying use SSI liberally to OSHA?
I can't explain that. Because what I know is
Mr. Kahn one of your counsel?
Yes, he is.
That reviews all these things?
That's correct.
Okay, so I guess in your testimony you said there were some in company management who initially thought that the Maritime Transportation Security Act of 2002 could be used to refuse to provide information to CSB.
And this was in that period of time in January, yes.
Do you think that, would you characterize Mr. Kahn's memo as still of that opinion that that SSI can be used to?
I would have to take a moment to review the memo itself and discuss that with our counsel. I can't make, this is the first time I've seen this document, and I can't make a judgment on that, sorry.
Okay, I know my time has expired. I'd encourage you to take a look at that, and I
will do so.
Didn't realize it would surprise you today to not know of that memo.
Let me just try to clear it up, if I may.
Sure.
Isn't there true there's a January 13, 2009 document, the bearer personnel responsible for examining whether or not to seek confidentiality for the MIC documents identified only one specific reason to do so, and that was a concern that information contained in them would be used by CSB to recommend reduction or elimination of MIC storage at the plant by using inherently safer technologies?
That's true. I have seen that document.
So there's no evidence prior to January 13th of 2009 that the company was discussing national security concerns over the release of any documents.
Again, I would say that in the context of the requested information from the CSB, we felt like it was going beyond the scope of the accident itself and moving off into a direction of looking at all the other information surrounding MIC, and this individual made a speculation in a PowerPoint presentation.
Right, that was a PowerPoint presentation. And there was no real concern prior to that time about national security.
Not before that time, because we didn't really understand it.
Okay. Mr. Burgess for questions.
I don't know that I've got much more to add, but just for my own clarification, the night of the incident, there would have been no reason for the plant operator who made the 911 call to have assumed that there was sensitive security information and that he must be careful with what he disclosed or didn't disclose to the responders. Is that correct?
That's correct.
So I guess we then are left to assume that the disconnects there were disconnects because of a crisis and people have made mistakes in the process of doing their job?
That's correct.
And you are going to fix that because the plant is important to the community. We've heard that testimony in the previous panel, and obviously we're putting people at risk in the plant, the people who come in to help you when you have a problem, and the people next door at the college. So we're going to reassure the committee that and the community at large that is happening and an ongoing part of your internal safety protocol?
You're absolutely correct, Congressman Burgess.
But that really has nothing to do with national security?
No, sir.
Okay.
So, if I could just add to that, I mean, we have already changed our procedures and protocols, and we're in a position now where we're going to carry out a drill, an emergency drill, to really test those again to make sure that we've done the right things.
Okay. And I'm just like Mr. Walden, I would suspect that there's some significant bridge building that needs to occur between the community and the first responders, because that was a serious incident and
we
put
are committed.
A lot of people at risk.
Yes.
And I think they justifiably feel that they weren't getting accurate, timely information that they needed to do their jobs and do it safely. And then I guess, Admiral Watson, if I could ask you, what let's just assume that there was significant sensitive security information, and had Bayer CropScience not followed the protocol, what penalty would they be facing today? What if they had released sensitive security information and just open the books? Mr. Bresland comes in and says, "Let me see what you've got." They open the books. Sensitive security information is sitting right out there on page 1, and they disclose it. What happens?
That would have been perfectly fine, sir.
No whistles, no bells, no lights?
No, sir, because this CSB, just like this committee, is a covered person. So if you have a need to know, you're authorized by law to have access to SSI.
Okay, well then let's take it even one step further. What if it was the Daily Herald that came in and they opened the books up and there's SSI on the front page and it gets printed in the newspaper? What penalties?
Then Bayer has an obligation to keep that information secure.
Well, what if they didn't? What would happen then? What's the worst case scenario for them?
Well, the worst case would be a civil penalty.
Okay.
Can I make one point there?
Yes, please.
Just to follow up on that. The issue for the Chemical Safety Board was not the receipt of the information. We were allowed to receive it. Our issue was, could we have a public meeting and explain what happened at that on that night of August 28th without disclosing what was alleged by Bayer to be sensitive security information? Had we done that, and had that been shown to be sensitive security information, I could have lost my job. There could have been penalties against me. Our investigators could have lost their jobs. That is the penalty that's laid down in the regulations. And that's why we were concerned about this.
Sure, and I understand that, but that would have been the case whether or not Bayer CropScience said it was sensitive security information or not. Would it not? Had you disclosed information that put national security at risk, I mean, does Bayer's interpretation of the information at this point, does that then, is that what's guiding you on releasing the information or not releasing the information?
It appears that Bayer is the decision maker on what is SSI. They say it's SSI. They give it to us. We can't do anything with it.
Admiral, is that the intent of this protection for national security?
Yes.
That Bayer would make that determination?
Bayer is supposed to know their duties and responsibilities under the regulation for SSI, which is pretty clear. I mean, there's 16 categories. They evaluate each piece of information against those categories. If it's SSI, they label it SSI, and then it's perfectly normal for the CSB to assume if it's marked SSI, it is SSI. There is a process by which they can sort of appeal that SSI classification, and that's the case where it would go to the Coast Guard or the Transportation Security Administration.
All right, again, just playing devil's advocate, is there any penalty for Bayer for inappropriately labeling something SSI when it is not? Since they're the arbiter of the determinant of whether or not it's their obligation, you said, to...
There's definitely a penalty for not labeling something SSI that should be SSI.
Okay, so they're under
I don't know the answer to your question about mislabeling.
Well, I'm just wondering if there's a scenario where Bayer might be prone to overinterpret to stay out of trouble, stay out of congressional committees and writs and subpoenas and the sort of things we do. And I'm just asking the question because I honestly don't know. It seems like there's some definitional difficulties that we have that are leading to certainly making Mr. Bresland's life miserable on what he can and can't do, and have created a congressional committee to work well into the afternoon on this. But that's just purely conjecture on my part. It seems like this is something that could be tightened up considerably, but Admiral, I'll leave that obviously up to the Coast Guard.
We are an independent agency, and we have the authority to go out and investigate chemical accidents. And much as we love the Coast Guard, we don't want to be going to them every time we write a report and saying, please check this for SSI, especially if the information is what I'd consider to be frivolous when it comes to a definition of SSI. We have no interest in guards, guns, fences. There are experts at DHS and the Coast Guard who deal with that issue. We have absolutely nothing to do with that, and we have no interest in ever working on dealing with that.
I guess that's what I'm having difficulty understanding, is how we came to such an impasse on this. Was it the inappropriate labeling of documents as SSI by Bayer? Was Bayer doing that in abundance of caution because they did not want to invoke civil penalties? I guess that's where I'm having the disconnect.
Well, I think Mr. Walton made an interesting point in asking and just saying, what was the motive here? And I can't read people's minds. I don't know what their motive was.
I wouldn't want to. You obviously sent it to council, and you got solicited advice that you paid for, and you took them at their word when they came back and said, you better not disclose this. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay, well, Mr. Chairman, I think we've, I'll yield back the balance of my time.
Well, thank you, Mr. Burgess. There is no civil penalty if you produce too much information. There's only a civil penalty underneath the Maritime Act if you don't take sensitive information and label it. So you can bury a company with SSI information. For instance, 2,000 documents they declared are SSI here that we feel had no national security inference. So that's 2,000 documents. How many pages in each document? You're probably talking thousands and thousands of pages. Coast Guard would have to go through and make a determination if there's national security interests. Maybe there should be a penalty for companies that use the Maritime Act to overwhelm us with paperwork that has nothing to do with national security.
Well, yeah, well, exactly the point. And I think perhaps, and I don't know whether it's our jurisdiction, but perhaps there could be some clarity for the company and all concerned, because it doesn't sound like there was an abundance of clarity in this situation. But again, I'll yield back.
Well, if we had a literal approach as opposed to a liberal approach, as we saw in the memo, maybe we wouldn't have been on that issue so long. Let me ask this question. Mr. Crosby, committee staff's heard from several people, including Bayer employees, that the startup and shutdown is the most dangerous part of any chemical process. Is that correct?
Yeah, yes it is.
Okay. And I understand that this explosion occurred as we were restarting the methyl unit, right?
We'd been in the process of restarting that unit over a number of days, yes.
Well, if it's the most particularly dangerous time, then isn't that precisely when you'd want to make sure your MEC air monitors were working and the video cameras were recording?
As I explained to you at the time, I mean, I wasn't aware that the MIC monitors were not working at the time of the incident.
But-
I subsequently found that out. Those monitors are there
Yeah,
to.
but some Bear employee must know that, right? I mean, if it's the most dangerous part and you're restarting this unit and your safety devices, the air monitors and the video cameras to get the process aren't working, someone had to decide to still restart the thing, even though the safety.
Well, and we also have we have a number of operators that actually work in that particular area as well. I mean, we have eyes and ears, and we have levels of instrumentation, and we have.
Sounds like your eyes and ears weren't on that day.
Our eyes and ears, we have highly trained chemical operators who were starting that process up. They were supported by a number of technical folks that were there. We have round-the-clock technical cover for the
Right, but
plants, and they were working on the restart process.
But unfortunately, the real eyes and ears went to check because the monitors were indicating increased temperature, and those folks were killed, right?
Congressman Stupak, if
Yes.
I could, please. We did an internal investigation, a very thorough one, and out of that we've identified several multiple factors that contributed to the accident itself. We've gone back and we've dedicated the site to further train the individuals to look at our standard operating procedures to ensure that this accident never happens again.
Well,
including everything that you just acknowledged.
okay, you've had it since 2002, so you've had about 7 years, and we've got about 3 or 4 incidents. In fact, the one in September of, 8 months before this one, September of 07, and we seem to have the same repeat complaints about lack of communication, things like this.
Right.
And you bypassed the internal safety systems on this heater unit to get it to work.
I wasn't aware of that, and I can assure you that will not happen again.
Well, if we're really concerned about safety then, and I know you didn't want Mick to be part of the public debate, that's why you had the SSI invoked to try to stop that public debate, but in light of what we've learned today of this recent accident there of last August, will you then on behalf of Bayer CropScience commit today to implementing a safer technology that eliminates the Mick stockpiles at your plant?
I won't commit to eliminating these, endorsing or bringing in new inherent safer technologies. I think what we have to do is we have to continue to assess new technologies as they become available.
Why wouldn't you eliminate it in light of the accident and the near worst case scenario we almost had? Is it a monetary thing that costs a reduplication? I mean, the DuPont plant did it. And then, as I read from the early report from '94, the Israelis used different chemicals to get the same results from their pesticides.
Right.
Why are we the only company left that still has this storage and this MIC unit? How come you just don't produce what you need that day and that's all for that day? Why don't you do that?
I'm going to let Mr. Crosby answer that question.
Sure,
sir.
Yep. So we believe that the process that we use to produce and store MIC at Institute is the safest process that's available for the products that we make. We have 4 different manufacturing plants. Some of those operate continuously, some of those operate on a batch-wise process. If we were to introduce inherently safer technology, then we would essentially have to implement 4 independent small units, each operating in conjunction with each of those manufacturing plants.
Sure, and that would be the day-to-day use, right, of the MIC?
That would be today's use, yeah.
But wouldn't that be safer than what you're doing now?
We don't believe so, sir, because the reason being is those 4 plants would go through multiple startups and shutdowns. And that itself imposes an inherent risk. We believe the safest way of making MIC and using that in our production is to make it at one point of use, is to store a quantity of a maximum of 2 to 3 days of inventory. That's all that we store.
Well, let me ask you this.
Around our processes.
Either you or Mr. Buckner can answer. If you don't want to stop storing it, like I think you should, then how about this? Will Bayer agree then to have a third party come in and conduct an independent analysis of your safety use of MIC? Will you commit to have someone else look at it other than just you?
I'd have to take that back and have a discussion with our plant operators to ensure, one, that what we have done in the past was one, thorough enough, and two, really challenge the fact whether or not there are inherent safer technologies out there.
Well,
before I commit 100%.
Well, Mr. Bresland, then I hope, if they won't stop storage, they won't have a third party look at it. I hope that in one of your recommendations that Bayer should eliminate the storage of large quantities of MIC at this plant. And if they have to do 4 different systems, then let them do 4 different systems. I hope that's one of your recommendations. I know it brought up Ms. Christensen, some of the others brought that up, and I'd suggest that.
Chairman Stupak, we look
Yes.
forward to that opportunity to work with the CSB to understand what ideas they might have for us as well as part of the process.
Yeah, that's good, but I hope, since you're reluctant even to have a third-party independent review your safety procedures and how you're handling this MIC, especially when you put a bypass system in, the monitors aren't working, the air quality, the cameras. It seems like all the things that should have been in place, you bypassed them or turned them off during the most dangerous time, which is loading and unloading, you're saying, starting up the process. So maybe we shouldn't use it. Why should we just allow one company in this country still stockpile this much? I guess I find that ironic. We dodged the bullet here today. The next one we might not. And even the notification for the emergency response people. Having been there, having done that myself, you know, we alluded to traffic accidents. Even traffic accidents, when you have an 18-wheeler roll over, right on the truck it says what it is, so we know when the firefighters approach it or train. But in your place, we never got past your front door, so we had no idea what it was. And until today, the people on the first panel said they didn't know what was coming out of it. Methomyl or whatever it was. So, well, we look forward to your investigation and your report on Thursday, and look forward to continuing to work with you and get this matter resolved. I have no further questions. Mr. Burgess, anyone else? Ms. Capto, I got to comment you again for staying with us all day. And
we have two questions
Sure.
From council that are so involved and intricate that I'm going to submit them in writing because I don't understand them myself.
Well, thank you. And thank you to all of our witnesses today. Thanks for everyone coming. That concludes our questioning. I want to thank all the witnesses for their coming today and for your testimony. As Mr. Burgess knows, the committee rules provide that members shall have 10 days to submit additional questions for the record. So that concludes our hearing. The meeting of the subcommittee is adjourned.
Thank you.
Right. You don't want to do that too often. No, sir. Thank you. Thank you. It was very informative hearing about your job in West Virginia.
Well, and my job was not to attack the Coast Guard. In fact, I think you did a fine job.
Thank you.
I just looked to.
I have to hand it to the first responders in the area. You got some real challenges.
We do. And as I look at the SSI issue, I'm regulatory background. I see how there's no other word that constitutes all these requirements under all the other laws, Clean Air Act, Clean Water Act, just OSHA, so that's where my concern's coming from, and it's part of course it's
I would encourage you to go to the area maritime security committees meetings that are held there in Westport and Huntington. That would be the place to really get a lot more comfortable with these standards. It's challenging, but I think it's something we got to work out as far as compatibility. And you heard the chief there. I mean, the first thing, and I've experienced this myself. The first thing everybody's thinking is, now they're opening something to get attacked, and you don't know. And so you want to be able to have a security regime that's just as good as the safety regime.
And I'm a member of the federal RRP for a reason. Of course, that's totally operated by the Coast Guard EPA.
Sure.
And that really has never come up. Our next meeting is 2 weeks ago, I think. 3 weeks. I'll make sure that's a topic of conversation.
Well, that would be great. Yeah. And I think we'll put out something. We're going to have to keep working on education on this SSI. First of all, first responders are covered personally. So if anybody ever tells a first responder that has the need to know,